January 14th, 1887. The winter wind cut through the wooden slats of the shanties lining East 15th Street, carrying the heavy stench of coal smoke, wet wool, and the waste of 3,000 cattle recently driven through the stockyards. Fort Worth sat heavy in the mud, a city divided by the Trinity River and further cleaved by the invisible line between the respectable business district and the sprawling, lawless district known as Hell's Half Acre. In the acre, the sun did not seem to rise so much as the gray gloom simply lightened enough to reveal the debris of the previous night. Broken bottles, unconscious drunks, and the churned muck of the unpaved streets defined the landscape. Jim Courtright walked these streets with a stride that claimed ownership of every plank and puddle. He stood well over 6 feet tall, his long, dark hair tucked beneath a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed eyes accustomed to looking down gun barrels. He wore a heavy canvas duster, stained at the hem with the red clay of the street, shielding a dark suit that had seen better years. On his hips rested 2 Colt revolvers, the ivory handles yellowed from sweat and handling. Positioned for a cross-draw that locals claimed was faster than the blink of a nervous eye. He did not rush. The morning was his business hours, and his business was the TIC commercial agency. The TIC badge pinned to his vest was a piece of tin that granted him authority nowhere in the state statutes, but in the acre, it carried more weight than a judge's gavel. It stood for a detective agency in name, but in practice, it was a license to extort. Courtright paused outside the rusted hinges of a low-slung gambling hall near the corner of Rusk Street. The establishment had no proper sign, only a painted steerhead fading on the clapboard siding. The sound of coughing and the clink of glass from inside signaled that the patrons were either early risers or leftovers from the night before. Courtright adjusted his gun belt, feeling the familiar weight of the iron against his hips, and pushed the door open. The room smelled of stale beer and damp sawdust. A bartender with the erratic beard and a dirty apron froze in the middle of wiping down the mahogany counter. 2 men playing faro in the corner lowered their cards, their eyes darting to the doorway before fixing on the floor. Courtright did not speak immediately. He let the door swing shut behind him, cutting off the wind and sealing the occupants in with him. He walked to the bar, his boot heels striking the floorboards with a heavy rhythmic thud that echoed in the sudden silence. He stopped directly in front of the bartender, placing both large hands flat on the sticky surface of the wood. The bartender, a man known locally as Dutch, swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He knew the schedule. Every business in the acre that wished to avoid sudden raids, mysterious fires, or the aggressive removal of unruly patrons by the city police, whom Courtright still controlled through fear and old alliances, paid the TIC agency. Dutch reached under the counter, his hands trembling slightly, and produced a small canvas sack. He placed it on the bar, the metal coins inside clinking dully. Courtright stared at the sack, then back up at Dutch. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Courtright reached out with one hand and picked up the sack. He weighed it in his palm, his expression unchanging. It was light. Too light. He undid the drawstring and poured the contents onto the bar. A meager pile of silver dollars and a handful of quarters spilled out. It was less than half of the agreed weekly sum. Courtright did not yell. He did not curse. He simply swept the coins onto the floor with a violent backhand swipe of his arm. The silver scattered across the sawdust, rolling under tables and boots. The faro players did not move to pick them up. Dutch began to stammer excuses, speaking of a slow week, the cattle drive moving north too quickly, the cost of whiskey rising. Courtright listened without blinking. When the bartender ceased speaking, the large man reached across the bar with a speed that belied his size. He grabbed a fistful of the bartender's shirt and apron, yanking the man forward. The wood of the bar dug into Dutch's stomach as he was hauled off his feet, his face inches from Courtright's. Courtright stated that the TIC did not offer credit. He explained that protection required resources and those resources were not free. He released the man with a shove that sent Dutch stumbling back into the shelves of liquor bottles. Glass shattered, sending amber liquid cascading down the wall. Before the bartender could regain his balance, Courtright drew one of his Colts. He did not fire. Instead, he reversed the weapon in his hand, gripping the barrel. He brought the heavy ivory grip down onto the bar top with a force that cracked the wood, a warning shot of pure physical power. He ordered Dutch to find the rest of the money. He gave the man 10 minutes. Courtright turned his back on the bar and walked to a table, pulling out a chair and sitting down to wait. He took out a small knife and began to clean his fingernails, ignoring the frantic activity behind the bar as Dutch pried up floorboards and emptied his own pockets to gather the necessary funds. The patrons in the corner remained frozen, knowing that any sudden movement could be misinterpreted by the man cleaning his nails. This was the reality of the acre. There was no recourse to the city marshal, for the city marshal was often drinking with Courtright in the evenings. There was no appeal to the mayor, for the mayor preferred the revenue of the vice district to remain high, and Courtright ensured order was kept in a way that kept the money flowing. Violence was the currency, and Courtright was the wealthiest man in town. After 8 minutes, Dutch placed a second, heavier bag on the table. He wiped blood from a cut on his hand onto his apron. Courtright put away his knife. He took the bag, added it to his deep coat pocket, and stood up. He told Dutch that next week the price would increase by 10% to cover the inconvenience. He tipped his hat brim slightly, a mockery of politeness, and walked out back into the gray morning. Outside, the air felt colder. Courtright moved to the next establishment on his list, a brothel 2 doors down. The madam met him at the door with an envelope already in hand. She did not make eye contact. He took the envelope, checked the contents quickly, and nodded. This was how the machine worked. It relied on the absolute certainty that resistance resulted in pain. He continued his rounds, moving from the dilapidated shacks of the lower acre toward the more substantial brick buildings closer to 12th Street. The mud here was mixed with gravel, offering slightly better footing. He passed a group of cowboys fresh from the trail, their eyes red from cheap whiskey. They parted to let him pass, recognizing the stride of a predator. One young drover new to the city started to make a comment, but an older companion grabbed his arm and silenced him, whispering the name, Long Hair. The name alone was enough to sober the youth. Courtright's reputation was built on a foundation of corpses. He had been the city marshal of Fort Worth years prior, a time when he tamed the rowdy town with a shotgun and a lack of hesitation. He had killed men who refused to surrender. He had killed men who drew too slow. After losing the office, he had drifted, working as a hired gun for mining interests in New Mexico, where he killed squatters and rivals with equal efficiency. He had returned to Fort Worth not as a servant of the law, but as a man who understood that the law was a tool to be wielded by the strong. By noon, his pockets were heavy with gold and silver. He stopped for lunch at a chop house on Main Street, at a place where the tablecloths were checked red and white and the steak was served rare. He ate alone. No one approached his table. The waiter refilled his coffee cup without being asked and retreated instantly. Courtright chewed his meat slowly, his mind calculating the receipts. The acre was profitable, but it was small money compared to the establishments further uptown. He looked through the window at the bustling street. Carriages with matched horses trotted by, carrying men in silk hats and women in velvet. The wealth of the cattle boom was transforming Fort Worth from a dusty outpost into a metropolis of the prairie. Courtright felt he deserved a larger share of that transformation. He had kept the peace that allowed these businesses to thrive. He had cleared out the worst of the bandits so the bankers could build their vaults. He finished his meal and paid with coins taken from the first stop of the morning. He stepped back onto the sidewalk, lighting a cigar. The smoke swirled around his head in the damp air. He turned his gaze north toward the intersection of Main and 3rd. There, the White Elephant Saloon stood as a beacon of high-class vice. It was not a shack in the acre. It was a palace of gaslights, polished brass, and high-stakes gambling. It was run by men who considered themselves businessmen, not saloon keepers. Courtright knew the owners of the White Elephant. He knew Jake Johnson, a man of influence, and he knew the new partner, Luke Short. Short was a name that carried its own weight, a man known in Dodge City and Tombstone. A man who dressed like a dandy but was rumored to handle a gun with professional detachment. Courtright took a long drag of his cigar. He had not yet pressed the White Elephant for dues. He had let them operate, watching their profits soar. The TIC commercial agency was ready to expand its client list. Courtright believed that everyone paid in the end. It was simply a matter of applying the correct amount of pressure. He began to walk north, leaving the grime of the acre behind, his boots sounding sharp on the wooden boardwalks of the business district. As he walked, he encountered a pair of uniformed police officers on patrol. They stopped and nodded respectfully to him. Courtright greeted them by name. They asked him how business was. He told them business was steady. They laughed, a nervous, ingratiating sound. They knew that Courtright could have their badges stripped with a word to the right councilman. They also knew that in a confrontation their uniforms would not stop a .45 caliber slug. They stepped aside, allowing him the center of the walkway. He passed a gunsmith shop, pausing to look at the display in the window. New models of Winchester rifles and Smith & Wesson revolvers gleamed behind the glass. Courtright preferred his Colts. They were single-action, simple, rugged. He did not trust the new double-action mechanisms. He believed in the thumb-cocking motion, the deliberate act of preparing the weapon. It gave a man a split second to ensure his aim was true. He had never needed more than one shot to settle an argument. He continued his patrol of his domain. He stopped at a livery stable where he kept a horse, checking on the animal. He spoke to the beast with more tenderness than he had shown any human that day. He paid the stable boy generously, ensuring the horse received the best oats. It was a strange dichotomy, the capacity for care alongside the capacity for brutality. The afternoon wore on, the sky darkening early as storm clouds thickened. The temperature dropped, freezing the mud into jagged ruts. Courtright buttoned his duster. He decided to make one more stop before retiring to his office. He headed toward a small gambling parlor on the edge of the respectable district, a place that straddled the line between the acre and uptown. The owner of this parlor, a man named Timothy, saw Courtright coming through the front window. Timothy did not wait for the door to open. He hurried outside, coatless in the freezing air, holding a sealed envelope. He met Courtright on the sidewalk, handing over the payment with a bow. Timothy asked if there was anything else the marshal needed. He still called him marshal despite the lack of official title. Courtright took the envelope. He looked at Timothy, a small, shivering man. He asked Timothy if there had been any trouble with drifters. Timothy shook his head vigorously, saying, "The TIC sign in the window kept everyone in line." Courtright nodded. This was the service he provided. He sold fear, and the sign was a totem of that fear. As long as the sign was up, the chaotic violence of the frontier was held at bay, replaced by the organized extortion of one man. He walked back to his office, a small room above a dry goods store. He climbed the narrow stairs, the wood creaking under his bulk. Inside, he lit a kerosene lamp. The office was sparse. A desk, 2 chairs, a safe. He sat at the desk and opened the day's collection bags. He began to count the money, stacking the coins into neat pillars. The gold and silver gleamed in the yellow lamplight. This was his empire. It was built on the bruised ribs of bartenders and the terrified compliance of shopkeepers. But as he counted, his mind drifted back to the White Elephant. The take from the acre was steady, but it was dirty money, collected in nickels and dimes. The White Elephant dealt in thousands. The poker pots there could buy a city block. If he could bring the White Elephant under the TIC umbrella, the rest of the uptown businesses would follow. No one would dare refuse him if Luke Short and Jake Johnson paid. It would be the crowning achievement of his career in Fort Worth. He would not just be the king of the acre, he would be the master of the entire city. He finished counting and locked the money in the safe. He blew out the lamp and sat in the dark for a moment, listening to the wind rattle the window pane. He felt no guilt for his actions. In his mind, he was a necessary force. Men like Dutch and Timothy needed a ruler. Without him, they would be devoured by the wolves that roamed the prairies. He was the biggest wolf, and therefore he was entitled to the largest portion of the kill. He stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the streetlights flickering to life below. The city was waking up for the night. Pianos started to play in the distance. The shouts of men and the laughter of women drifted up from the saloons. It was a symphony of vice, and he was the conductor. Jim Courtright adjusted his hat, checked the position of his guns one last time, and turned to the door. The night was young, and there were still people who needed to be reminded of who owned the streets of Fort Worth. He stepped out into the hallway, his mind set on the future, unaware that the resistance he would soon encounter would not be a trembling bartender, but a man made of the same cold iron as himself. The date was January 14th, and the clock was ticking toward a collision that would shake the foundations of the city. January 20th, 1887. The gaslights inside the White Elephant Saloon burned with a steady hissing luminescence that banished the winter night pressing against the plate glass windows of Main Street. Here in the heart of Fort Worth's uptown district, the air did not smell of stockyard offal or unwashed bodies. It carried the rich, layered aromas of imported Havana tobacco, bay rum hair tonic, and the sharp tang of rye whiskey poured from crystal decanters. The temperature was controlled, kept comfortable by two massive cast-iron stoves that radiated heat into the high-ceilinged room, a stark difference from the drafty shanties of the river bottoms. Luke Short stood near the entrance of the long mahogany bar, surveying his domain with eyes that missed nothing. He was a small man, standing only 5 feet and 6 inches and weighing perhaps 150 pounds wet. To the uninitiated, he looked less like a gunfighter and more like a prosperous haberdasher or a bank clerk on his evening out. He wore a tailored sack coat of dark wool, a silk vest embroidered with subtle floral patterns, and a pristine white shirt with a high starch collar. A diamond stick pin large enough to catch the gaslight and throw sparks of color secured his silk cravat. On his head sat a top hat, brushed to a high sheen, which added a few necessary inches to his stature. He did not carry his weapons in heavy holsters slung low on his hips like the drovers or the ruffians from the acre. Short preferred discretion. A Colt revolver with a cut-down barrel resided in a leather-lined pocket inside his coat, invisible but instantly accessible. He relied on speed and surprise, not intimidation. He moved through the crowded room with a grace that was almost feline, stepping around patrons and waiters without breaking his stride or his line of sight. He was 33 years old, and his face was smooth, handsome, and unreadable. The White Elephant was more than a saloon. It was a cathedral of chance. The first floor housed the bar, a structure of polished wood and brass rails that stretched 50 feet along the wall. Mirrors imported from France reflected the crowd, doubling the sense of activity. Above the bar hung oil paintings of racehorses and pastoral scenes framed in heavy gilt. Men in frock coats and businessmen in suits leaned against the rail, discussing the price of beef and the expansion of the railroads. This was the center of commerce in Fort Worth as much as the banks were. Deals struck over glasses of bourbon and sealed with a handshake. Short moved toward the gambling tables located in the rear of the room and on the second floor. This was where the real revenue flowed. He checked the faro bank, watching the dealer slide cards from the metal box. The dealer, a man named Bat, though not the famous Masterson who was also a friend, handled the tools of the trade with rhythmic efficiency. Short watched the bets go down, stacks of gold, eagles and silver dollars placed on the layout of spades and hearts. He calculated the house percentage in his head automatically. The house always won, not by cheating, but by the relentless mathematics of the game. Short insisted on honest games. A crooked game brought trouble in Lawman. An honest game brought repeat customers with deep pockets. A commotion at a poker table near the stairs drew his attention. A large cattleman, face flushed with drink and frustration, was raising his voice at a smaller man across the felt. The cattleman slammed a fist onto the table, causing the chips to jump. He accused the other player of dealing from the bottom of the deck. The accusation hung in the air, silencing the conversations at the nearby tables. In the West, such words were often a prelude to gunfire. The dealer looked nervous, his hands hovering away from the deck to show innocence. Short arrived at the table before the echo of the shout had faded. He did not shout back. He stepped between the cattleman and the accused, placing a hand gently on the back of the cattleman's chair. He spoke in a voice that was soft, low, and devoid of aggression, yet it carried a tone of absolute authority. He asked the gentleman what the difficulty seemed to be. The cattleman spun around, ready to transfer his anger to the intruder, but paused when he saw who it was. He looked down at the small dandy, blinking in confusion. The cattleman blustered that he had lost 3 hands in a row and that it wasn't natural. Short smiled, a thin expression that did not reach his eyes. He explained that luck was a fickle mistress and that the house guaranteed the integrity of every deck. He offered to replace the deck with a fresh one, still in the wrapper, to put the man's mind at ease. He signaled a waiter to bring a fresh bottle of the house's best bourbon on the house to help soothe the sting of the losses. It was a master class in de-escalation. Short offered the man a way to save face while simultaneously asserting control. The cattleman, realizing he was making a scene in the finest establishment in Texas, grunted his acceptance. He sat back down, the tension draining from his shoulders. Short nodded to the dealer to continue. He stayed for a moment, watching the fresh deck being shuffled, ensuring the ritual was performed correctly. He caught the eye of the dealer, a silent message to keep the game tight. Short walked away, adjusting his cuffs. He despised violence in his place of business. Gunsmoke ruined the curtains and scared away the high rollers. He had seen enough blood in his time, in Leadville, in Tombstone, in Dodge City. He had fought to protect his interest before, but he preferred the quiet hum of a well-oiled machine. He was a businessman first, a gambler second, and a gunman only when the first 2 failed. He made his way to the private office at the back where his partner, Jake Johnson, was reviewing the ledger. Johnson was a sturdy man, well connected in Fort Worth politics and society. He looked up as Short entered. Johnson pointed to the column of figures on the paper. The week's profits were substantial. The cattle drive money was still circulating, and the winter weather drove men indoors to spend it. Short poured himself a glass of water from a pitcher on the sideboard. He did not drink alcohol while he was working. A clear head was his greatest asset. He told Johnson about the incident at the poker table. Johnson frowned, noting that rowdy behavior was bad for the reputation. Short assured him it was handled. They spoke of the need to hire another lookout for the weekend rush, someone who could spot a cheat or a troublemaker before they sat down. Johnson mentioned that he had heard rumors from the street. He hesitated before speaking the name. He said that Jim Courtright was making rounds in the acre again, shaking down the saloons and brothels with renewed vigor. Short took a sip of water and set the glass down. He dismissed the news with a shrug. Courtright was a relic of a different time, a bully who preyed on the weak. The White Elephant was not a crib in the acre. It was a legitimate enterprise, paying city taxes and operating under the protection of its own standing in the community. Short stated that Courtright knew better than to bring his racket to Main Street. The businessmen of the uptown district would not stand for it. They had the mayor's ear and they had the financial power to crush a petty extortionist. Johnson looked less convinced. He knew Courtright's history. He knew the man was desperate and dangerous, a combination that often defied logic. Johnson warned that Courtright saw himself as the law, regardless of whether he wore a badge. Short checked his pocket watch, a heavy gold timepiece attached to a chain across his vest. It was nearing 10 o'clock. The theater crowd would be arriving soon. The White Elephant was unique in that it was connected to the building's theater, drawing in patrons who sought entertainment beyond just cards and whiskey. Short enjoyed the diversity of the crowd. It validated his belief that gambling could be a gentleman's pursuit. He returned to the floor, the noise of the room washing over him. The piano player had started a lively ragtime tune, the notes bright and sharp. Short moved up the grand staircase to the second floor where the private rooms were located. Here the stakes were higher and the players required privacy. He knocked softly on a door and entered a room where 5 men sat around a table shrouded in cigar smoke. The game was no limit hold'em, a newer variation, but the pots were heavy with gold. Short greeted the men by name: a banker, a railroad surveyor, 2 ranch owners, and a cotton broker. They welcomed him, offering him a seat. Short declined, saying he was merely checking on their comfort. He signaled the attendant to bring a fresh box of cigars. He observed the stacks of chips. Thousands of dollars were on that table. This single room generated more revenue in a night than Dutch's saloon in the acre made in a year. He left the room and leaned on the balcony railing, looking down at the main floor. From this vantage point, he could see the patterns of movement. The waiters weaving through the tables with trays held high, the constant rotation of the roulette wheel, the animated conversations at the bar. It was a thriving ecosystem. Short felt a fierce pride in it. He had fought hard to establish himself here, to shed the dusty image of the frontier gambler and become a respected proprietor. He saw a man near the front door, hesitating. The man was dressed poorly, his clothes dusty and worn. The floor manager intercepted him immediately, speaking quietly. The man turned and left. Short nodded in approval. The White Elephant had standards. It was cruel, perhaps, but necessary. To maintain the illusion of luxury, the reality of poverty had to be kept at bay. Short descended the stairs, his hand trailing lightly on the polished banister. He thought about his past in Dodge City, the Dodge City War, where he had been run out of town by a political faction that wanted to clean up the city. He had returned with Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson, a show of force that reinstated his position without a shot being fired. He learned then that power was about perception and alliances. He believed he had both here in Fort Worth. He walked to the bar and signaled for a seltzer. The bartender served him instantly. Short leaned his back against the wood, watching the front doors. He was a man who lived by looking forward, predicting the next card, the next move of an opponent. But he had a blind spot. He underestimated the desperation of a man who felt his power slipping away. He saw the world through the lens of business and calculated risk. He did not account for the sheer, irrational entitlement of a man like Jim Courtright. As midnight approached, The crowd thickened. The noise level rose, a roar of laughter and shouting that vibrated in the chest. Short remained an island of calm in the center of it. He directed the flow of the room with subtle gestures, a nod to a dealer to speed up, a glance at a bouncer to watch a stumbling patron. He was the conductor of this symphony of vice. A young man, the son of a local judge, approached Short. He was tipsy and looking for a loan to continue playing. Short knew the father. He knew the trouble that would come if the son lost the family fortune. Short placed a hand on the young man's shoulder and firmly refused. He told the boy to go home, that his luck was out for the night. The boy argued, his face turning red. Short did not budge. He signaled for the boy's carriage to be brought around. He protected his customers, sometimes from themselves. This was the difference between a predator and a professional. The boy left, sullen but obedient. Short watched him go. He turned back to the room, satisfied. The night was profitable. The peace was kept. The White Elephant stood as a testament to civilization in a wild land. Short adjusted his silk cravat, checking his reflection in the mirror behind the bar. He saw a man in control. He did not see the shadow lengthening from the acre, a shadow shaped like a man in a duster with two ivory-handled guns. He walked over to the faro table where Bat was dealing. He took over the lookout chair for a moment, letting his friend take a break. He sat high in the chair, watching the layout. The cards came out of the box one by one. Win, lose, win, lose. It was a binary world of simple outcomes. Short preferred it that way. It was clean. The clock on the wall chimed one. The night was far from over. Short would stay until the last card was turned and the last lamp was extinguished. He was the guardian of this place. He had built it, and he would defend it. He did not know that the defense would require more than words and free bourbon. He did not know that the cold iron he kept in his pocket would soon be the only thing standing between him and oblivion. But for now, on the 20th of January, he was the king of the parlor, and his kingdom was secure. January 27th, 1887. The heavy oak doors of the White Elephant Saloon swung open against the biting winter wind, admitting a draft that swirled across the polished floorboards before the warmth of the coal stoves could swallow it. It was early evening, the hour when the day laborers had retreated to their homes and the nocturnal clientele of Fort Worth began to fill the establishments of Main Street. The saloon was already humming with the low, steady vibration of commerce and leisure. Waiters in white jackets moved between the tables with trays of crystal glassware, the clinking of ice and the murmur of conversation creating a familiar, comforting drone. Jim Courtright stepped through the entrance, pausing on the threshold to let his eyes adjust to the brilliance of the interior. He brought with him the smell of the street, cold mud, damp wool, and the faint metallic scent of ozone that hung in the air before a storm. He did not remove his hat. The wide brim cast a shadow over his face, hiding his eyes but doing nothing to conceal the prominent heavy jaw or the thick mustache that framed his mouth. He stood motionless for a long moment, a dark, imposing statue in the midst of the gaslight and gilt. The flow of traffic near the door stuttered as men noticed him. Conversations faltered and died away as recognition rippled through the front of the room. Courtright was not a stranger to the White Elephant, but he was an intruder in its current ecosystem. He belonged to the rougher, darker world of the acre, a world of sawdust floors and watered-down whiskey. Here, surrounded by oil paintings and velvet drapes, he looked like a rough-hewn stone dropped onto a fine china plate. He hooked his thumbs into his gun belt, the ivory handles of his revolvers pushing back the fabric of his long duster. He began to walk into the room, his boots striking the floor with a heavy, deliberate cadence that seemed to challenge the very structure of the building. He did not head for the bar immediately. Instead, he moved slowly through the crowd, his gaze sweeping over the gambling tables. He watched a game of billiards, his eyes tracking the ivory balls as they clicked against one another. He watched a man stack a tower of gold coins at a poker table, his expression unreadable. He was assessing the wealth of the room, calculating the nightly take, measuring the potential tithe he felt was his due. Every step he took claimed space. Men stepped aside, pressing themselves against walls or tables to avoid brushing against his coat. He did not acknowledge them. He moved with the arrogance of a man who believed he was the apex predator in any environment. Luke Short was standing near the far end of the bar, speaking quietly with his head bartender. He saw Courtright enter. Short did not stiffen, nor did he reach for the weapon concealed in his coat. He simply stopped speaking and turned his body to face the room, his hands resting easily on the bar rail. He watched Courtright's progress with a detached, clinical interest. He had expected this visit. The rumors of the TIC agency's expansion had been circulating for weeks. Short adjusted his diamond stick pin with a small, precise movement of his fingers, a gesture of grooming that signaled his composure. Courtright reached the bar. He did not take an open spot. He squeezed into a space between two cattle brokers, forcing them to move or be crushed. He placed his large hands on the mahogany surface, the rough skin of his knuckles contrasting with the smooth, polished wood. He signaled the bartender with a single raised finger. The bartender, a professional who had seen his share of trouble, approached with a neutral expression. Courtright ordered a whiskey. He did not specify a brand. He expected the best the house had to offer. The bartender poured a measure of Kentucky bourbon into a heavy glass and placed it before the large man. Courtright lifted the glass, inspecting the amber liquid against the light. He took a sip, savored it, and then drained the glass in one swallow. He slammed the glass back onto the bar with unnecessary force, the sound cracking through the ambient noise of the room like a pistol shot. He turned his back to the bar, leaning his elbows on the rail, and looked directly at Luke Short. Short held his gaze. He nodded once, a minimal greeting. He walked slowly down the length of the bar, closing the distance between them. He stopped 5 feet away, just out of arm's reach, maintaining a buffer of personal space. He asked Courtright if the drink was to his satisfaction. His voice was even, polite, the voice of a host addressing a guest. Courtright did not answer the question. He looked Short up and down, his eyes lingering on the silk vest and the top hat. He spoke with a gravelly rumble that carried easily over the noise of the room. He stated that it was a nice place Short had here. He said it was very clean, very rich. He looked around the room again, making a show of inspecting the ceiling, the chandeliers, the clientele. He said it would be a shame if anything were to happen to it. Short smiled, but the smile did not touch his eyes. He agreed that it was a fine establishment. He said they worked hard to keep it that way. He signaled the bartender to refill Courtright's glass. He told Courtright that they prided themselves on running a safe and orderly house. Courtright laughed, a short, harsh bark. He took the second drink, holding it in his hand. He stepped away from the bar, moving into the open floor, forcing Short to turn with him. He said that safety was a tricky thing. He said that trouble had a way of finding people, even in the nice parts of town. He mentioned that the police were busy men, often unable to respond quickly to disturbances. He said that a business like this, with so much money on the tables, attracted the wrong kind of attention. Short listened patiently. He knew the script. He had heard it in other towns from other men with badges and guns. He replied that they had their own security. He gestured vaguely to the floor managers and the lookouts stationed around the room. He said they were quite capable of handling any disturbances that might arise. Courtright shook his head slowly. He took a step closer to Short, invading the smaller man's space. He towered over Short, his bulk blocking the light from the nearest chandelier. He said that internal security was good, but it wasn't enough. He said that sometimes the trouble came from the outside, sometimes it was organized. He mentioned the TIC commercial agency. He said his agency specialized in preventing that kind of trouble. He said they offered a comprehensive protection package for businesses that wanted to operate without interruptions. Short did not retreat. He stood his ground, craning his neck slightly to look Courtright in the face. He asked what sort of interruptions Courtright was referring to. He asked for specifics. He wanted the threat to be spoken aloud, to strip away the veneer of business negotiation and reveal the extortion beneath. Courtright leaned in, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. He spoke of drunks wrecking the furniture. He spoke of fights breaking out in the gambling hall. He spoke of mysterious fires that started in the middle of the night. He said the TIC prevented these things. He said the price for this service was reasonable considering the profits the White Elephant was generating. He named a figure. It was a substantial sum, a weekly payment that would amount to a significant percentage of the saloon's net income. Short looked at the glass in Courtright's hand. He looked at the badge on Courtright's vest. He spoke clearly, ensuring that the men standing nearby could hear him. He said that he appreciated the offer. He said that Courtright was known for his effectiveness in the acre. But, he continued, the White Elephant was not in the acre. He said they paid their city taxes. They paid their licensing fees. They paid the salaries of their own staff. He said they had no need for additional services. He declined the offer. The rejection hung in the air. Courtright's face darkened. The veins in his neck stood out against his collar. He was not used to being told no. In the acre, a suggestion from long-haired Jim was a command. Here, this dandy in a silk vest was dismissing him like a peddler selling unwanted goods. Courtright tightened his grip on the whiskey glass. For a second, it seemed he might crush it. He stepped even closer, his chest almost brushing Short's shoulder. He lowered his voice so only Short could hear. He said that Short was making a mistake. He said that Short was new to Fort Worth and perhaps did not understand how things worked here. He said that this was his town. He said that people who did not pay the TIC often found it very difficult to stay in business. He said that accidents happened. Short did not blink. He kept his hands visible away from his pockets. He replied that he had been in business a long time. He said he understood the risks. He said he was not interested in paying for protection he did not need. He told Courtright that his money was good at the bar, and he was welcome to drink, but the business arrangement was not open for discussion. He turned slightly, dismissing Courtright, and signaled a waiter to attend to a nearby table. It was a calculated insult. Short was treating Courtright as a customer, not a threat. He was denying Courtright the fear that the big man fed upon. Courtright stood there, the fury radiating off him in waves. He looked at Short's back. His hand twitched toward his gun belt, a reflex born of years of violence. But he stopped. The room was watching. There were too many witnesses, too many prominent citizens. To draw down on an unarmed man in the middle of the White Elephant would be a blunder. He needed to be smarter. He needed to apply pressure, not just brute force. Courtright drained the whiskey and slammed the glass onto a nearby table, startling the players. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He spoke to Short's back. He said they would talk again. He said Short would change his mind. He said that when the trouble started, Short would come begging for the TIC to help. He turned on his heel, his duster swirling around his legs. He marched toward the door, his exit as aggressive as his entrance. He shouldered a patron aside without looking back. The room seemed to exhale as he left. The tension that had tightened every muscle in the saloon released, replaced by a sudden burst of nervous chatter. Men looked at each other, whispering. They had seen the confrontation. They had seen the king of the acre rebuffed. They knew this was not the end of it. Short walked back to the end of the bar. Jake Johnson emerged from the office, his face pale. He had watched the exchange from the doorway. He asked Short what Courtright had said. Short picked up a bar towel and wiped a spot of moisture from the wood. He told Johnson that Courtright wanted to sell them insurance. Johnson asked what Short had told him. Short said he told him they were self-insured. Johnson looked worried. He told Short that Courtright was not a man to be trifled with. He said Courtright had killed men for less than a public rejection. Short nodded. He knew the type. He had seen them in every boomtown from Kansas to Arizona. They were men who had outlived their usefulness, trying to hold on to power through intimidation. Short said they would not pay. He said once you pay a blackmailer, you never stop paying. He said if they gave in now, Courtright would own them. Short poured himself a glass of water. His hand was steady. He took a sip, the cool liquid soothing his throat. He looked out over the room. The gambling was resuming. The piano player started a new song. The world of the White Elephant was returning to its normal rhythm. But Short knew the rhythm had changed. The beat was slightly off. A discord had been introduced. He knew Courtright would escalate. A man like that could not afford to look weak. If the White Elephant refused to pay, other businesses might follow suit. Courtright's entire empire was built on the perception of inevitability. Short had just challenged that inevitability. He had thrown a wrench into the gears of the TIC machine. Short checked the position of the Colt in his coat pocket. He felt the hard outline of the cylinder against his ribs. It was a comforting weight. He hoped he would not have to use it. But as he watched the front door, half expecting Courtright to burst back in, he knew that hope was a fragile thing. He signaled the floor manager. He told him to keep a close eye on the door tonight. He told him to double the lookout. He said if Courtright returned, he wanted to know immediately. The night wore on. The wind outside howled, rattling the window panes. Inside, the gas lights hissed. Short moved through the room, greeting customers, buying rounds, playing the role of the gracious host. But his eyes were always moving, always scanning. He was a gambler, and he knew the odds. He had bet his life on his refusal. He intended to win the hand. The confrontation had lasted less than 10 minutes, yet it had shifted the axis of the city. The lines were drawn. On one side, the brute force of the old frontier, personified by Courtright. On the other, the cool, calculated resistance of the new business class, personified by Short. The White Elephant was no longer just a saloon. It was a fortress. And the siege had just begun. Short walked up the stairs to the balcony. He looked down at the spot where Courtright had stood. He could almost still see the dark shape of the man, a void in the light. He knew Courtright was out there in the dark, plotting, fuming. Short finished his water. He set the glass down on the railing. He would be ready. The heavy hand of Jim Courtright had fallen on the White Elephant, but Luke Short had not buckled. The next move belonged to the former marshal, and Short knew it would be a violent one. February 2nd, 1887. The heavy woolen curtain of winter had settled firmly over North Texas, turning the streets of Fort Worth into furrows of frozen gray mud that shattered under the weight of wagon wheels. The wind swept down from the panhandle, carrying needles of ice that scoured the brick facades of Main Street and rattled the window panes of the storefronts. Inside the White Elephant Saloon, the atmosphere was brittle, snapping with a tension that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. It was a Wednesday night, typically a slower evening for the gambling halls. But the main floor was populated with a steady stream of cattlemen, cotton brokers, and travelers seeking refuge from the biting wind. The heat from the massive coal stoves fought a losing battle against the chill that seemed to radiate from the very walls, or perhaps from the knowledge that the truce between the city's most dangerous men was fracturing. Luke Short stood at his usual vantage point near the end of the long mahogany bar. He was not drinking. His hands were clasped behind his back, his posture rigid. He watched the room with a gaze that did not blink, his eyes tracking the movement of every waiter and the rotation of every deal. The receipts for the last 3 days were down. It was a subtle drop, barely noticeable to an outsider, but to a man who measured his life in percentages and margins, it was a screaming alarm. The word was out on the street. Men whispered in the barbershops and the livery stables that the TIC commercial agency had marked the White Elephant. Timid money was staying home, and even the bold money was looking over its shoulder, expecting trouble to burst through the doors. Short adjusted the cuffs of his shirt, ensuring the starch was crisp. He nodded to a regular customer, a judge who was sipping a brandy near the stove, but his attention never wavered from the entrance. The saloon was a machine of commerce, usually humming with the sounds of laughter, the clinking of glass, and the riffle of cards. Tonight the machine was grinding. The conversations were hushed. Patrons spoke in low tones, their eyes darting toward the front windows every time a shadow passed by the glass. The air smelled of wet wool drying in the heat, mixed with the sharp tang of cigar smoke and the metallic scent of nervous sweat. At 9 o'clock, the double doors at the front of the saloon crashed open. They did not swing. They were thrown with enough force to bounce off the interior stops and shudder against the frame. Jim Courtright filled the opening, the gaslight from the street silhouetting his massive bulk against the dark. He was not alone this time. 2 men stood behind him, shadowed figures in long coats who looked more like hired thugs than detectives. They remained outside the threshold, a silent threat posted at the gate, while Courtright stepped into the warmth. He did not look at Short. He did not go to the bar. He walked directly toward the gaming tables at the rear of the room, his boots leaving muddy impressions on the polished floorboards. The sound in the saloon died. It was not a gradual quieting, but an instant strangulation of noise. The piano player, a man who had played through bar brawls and shootings, lifted his hands from the keys in mid-measure and froze. The click of billiard balls ceased. Courtright moved through the silence like a barge moving through dark water, his wake consisting of men scrambling to get out of his path. He wore the same duster, the same wide-brimmed hat, but his demeanor had shifted from arrogant negotiation to predatory enforcement. He stopped at a faro table where a young dealer named Harris was managing a game for 3 local ranchers. Courtright stood directly behind one of the seated ranchers. He loomed there, a mountain of intimidation breathing audibly through his nose. The rancher, a man who had faced stampedes and Comanche raids without blinking, stiffened in his chair. He did not turn around. He stared at his cards, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. Courtright reached out a hand, thick and scarred, and picked up a stack of chips from the rancher's pile. He rolled the clay discs between his fingers, the sound distinct and sharp in the quiet room. He let them drop back onto the table one by one. Clack, clack, clack. The sound was deafening. He spoke to the dealer, Harris. His voice was a low rumble carrying to the corners of the room. He asked Harris if the box was square. It was an accusation disguised as a question. Harris, pale and sweating despite the chill, stammered that the game was honest. He held his hands up, palms open, showing he had nothing to hide. Courtright leaned over the table, placing his weight on his hands, his face inches from the layout. He said it looked loose to him. He said it looked like the kind of game where a man could lose his whole herd if he wasn't careful. He looked at the ranchers. He told them they were fools to play here. He said the house was skinning them alive. One of the ranchers pushed his chair back and stood up. The legs of the chair scraped harshly against the wood floor. He gathered his remaining chips and mumbled an apology to no one in particular. He hurried toward the cashier's cage, eager to cash out and leave before the violence started. The other 2 followed suit within seconds, leaving their drinks unfinished. The table was empty. Courtright straightened up, a smirk buried beneath his mustache. He had cleared the game without drawing a weapon. He had used the weight of his reputation to crush the commerce of the table. Short watched this from the bar. His face remained a mask of calm, but the muscles in his jaw worked rhythmically. This was direct interference. It was an assault on his livelihood. He unclasped his hands and began to walk toward the back of the room. He did not run. He moved with a measured, lethal grace. He kept his right hand free, swinging naturally by his side, inches from the pocket where the Colt revolver rested. He stopped 10 feet from Courtright, placing himself between the big man and the rest of the gambling floor. He called out Courtright's name. It was not a shout, but the tone cut through the air like a whip. Courtright turned slowly. He looked at Short with feigned surprise. He asked if there was a problem. Short told him that he was disturbing the patrons. He said that if Courtright was not playing, he needed to step away from the tables. He said the White Elephant was a place of business, not a parade ground for bullies. He kept his voice steady, devoid of emotion, refusing to give Courtright the satisfaction of seeing anger. Courtright laughed. He walked toward Short, closing the distance until he was looking down at the smaller man. He said he was just looking out for the citizens of Fort Worth. He said it was his duty as a private detective to ensure that honest men were not being swindled. He pointed a finger at the faro table. He said he had heard reports that the boxes were rigged. He said he had a right to inspect them. He took another step, invading Short's personal space, trying to force the smaller man to step back. Short planted his feet. He did not move an inch. Short stepped into the finger, his chest bumping against Courtright's hand. He did not flinch. He told Courtright that he had no authority here. He said the TIC badge was a piece of tin sold to gullible shopkeepers. He said the games were inspected by the house, and the house's reputation was the only guarantee required. He ordered Courtright to leave. His eyes bored into Courtright's, hard and flat like polished agate. Courtright lowered his hand to his gun belt. He rested his palm on the ivory handle of his revolver. The threat was explicit. The room held its breath. Men dove behind tables. The bartender ducked below the counter. This was the moment everyone had feared. The ideal clash of iron and stone. Courtright smiled, a cold, humorless expression. He asked Short who was going to make him leave. He asked if Short intended to use the little pop gun he kept in his coat. Short did not reach for his weapon. He knew that to draw now, with Courtright's hand already on his gun, was suicide. Instead, he used the only other weapon available. He spoke to the room. He raised his voice, addressing the witnesses. He stated clearly that Jim Courtright was attempting to extort money from the White Elephant. He stated that because the house refused to pay blackmail, Courtright was harassing the customers. He turned the spotlight of public opinion onto the former marshal. He stripped away the veneer of the lawman and revealed the racketeer underneath. Courtright's eyes darted around the room. He saw the faces of the businessmen, the judges, the wealthy travelers. They were watching him. They were seeing him not as a protector, but as a thug. The narrative was slipping away from him. He realized that shooting an unarmed man in front of 50 witnesses would not be a victory. It would be a hanging offense, even for him. The social pressure of the uptown district was a force even he had to reckon with. He took his hand off his gun. He leaned in close to Short, his breath smelling of stale tobacco and onions. He whispered that this wasn't over. He said he could shut this place down without firing a shot. He said he would arrest the dealers. He said he would arrest Short. He claimed he had old statutes he could enforce, laws against gambling that were ignored for everyone else, but would be applied strictly to the White Elephant. He promised that he would bleed the saloon dry until the doors were boarded up. He threatened to drag Short through every court in the county until he was bankrupt. He turned and walked to the next table, a poker game involving a prominent cotton buyer. He kicked the leg of the chair the buyer was sitting in. The buyer jumped, spilling his drink across the green felt. Courtright apologized with a sneer. He told the man to be careful, that the floor was slippery. He walked through the room, bumping into waiters, knocking over a chair, creating a wake of chaos. He was demonstrating that he could destroy the ambiance of the saloon simply by existing within it. He stopped at the roulette wheel and spun it violently, disrupting the game in progress, laughing as the ball clattered uselessly across the numbers. Short watched him go. He saw the customers signaling for their checks. He saw the fear in the eyes of his staff. He realized that a defensive posture was no longer sufficient. Courtright was not going to stop. The man was a force of nature, eroding the foundation of the business like a flood. Short signaled to Jake Johnson, who was standing by the office door looking pale. Short walked over to his partner. He told Johnson that they needed to act. He said that diplomacy was dead. He said Courtright was going to escalate until someone was dead or the business was ruined. Johnson asked what they could do. Short said they needed to arm the staff. He said every dealer, every bartender, every lookout needed to be ready. He said the next time Courtright came in, he would not be met with silence. He would be met with a wall of resistance. He instructed Johnson to spread the word that the White Elephant would defend itself. Short returned to the floor. He walked to the faro table where Harris was still shaking. He placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. He told him to deal. He told him that if Courtright touched him again, Courtright would answer to Short personally. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a gold coin. He placed it on the table as a bet. He told the ranchers who had fled to the cage to come back. He said the drinks were on the house for the rest of the night. He forced a smile, trying to project a confidence he did not feel. It was a bold move to stabilize the room, but the damage was done. The energy of the night had been soured. The laughter did not return. The gambling was mechanical, devoid of joy. Men played their hands quickly and left. By 11 o'clock, the saloon was half empty. The wind howled outside, rattling the glass, sounding like a chorus of ghosts warning of what was to come. The emptiness of the room amplified the sound of the wind, making the saloon feel like a tomb. Short stayed at his post until the doors were locked at 2 in the morning. He watched the staff clean up the spilled drinks and the overturned chairs. He felt a cold resolve hardening in his gut. He had tried to be a businessman. He had tried to be civilized. But Courtright had brought the law of the jungle into the parlor. Short touched the handle of his gun through the fabric of his coat. It was cold, hard, unforgiving. He traced the outline of the hammer, the cylinder, the barrel. It was a tool he knew how to use, a tool he had hoped to leave behind. He walked to the window and looked out at the empty street. The gaslights were flickering in the wind. He knew Courtright was out there. He knew the man was planning his next move. The legal threats were serious. If Courtright started arresting dealers, the business would collapse. But Short knew that the legal threats were just a cover. Courtright was a man of violence. The arrests would be a pretext to get Short or his men isolated, away from the safety of the crowd. Short turned from the window. He checked the load in his revolver. 5 cartridges, 1 empty chamber under the hammer. He spun the cylinder. The mechanical whir was the only sound in the empty room. He holstered the weapon. He knew that the time for words had passed. The stone had struck the iron and the sparks were already flying. The next confrontation would not be a debate. It would be a collision. He walked to the back office to count the night's take. It was light. Painfully light. The ledger showed the cost of Courtright's visit in black and white. Short closed the book with a snap. He would not let a bully take what he had built. He would not run. He had run from Dodge and it had tasted like ash. He would stand here in Fort Worth on the polished floors of the White Elephant. And if Jim Courtright wanted to take it, he would have to step over Luke Short's dead body to do it. Short sat in the office for a long time. listening to the settling of the building. The wood creaked as it cooled. He thought about the men he employed. They were good men skilled at their trade, but they were not gunmen. They looked to him for protection. He was the barrier between them and the chaos of the acre. He realized that he could not rely on the city police. The police were terrified of Courtright. Short was alone. He stood up and put on his overcoat. He extinguished the lamp in the office. He walked out into the main room, now dark except for the glow of the streetlights through the window. He walked to the spot where Courtright had stood. He could still feel the man's presence, a heavy, suffocating weight. Short spat on the floor, right where Courtright's boots had been. It was a small act of defiance, but it felt necessary. He unlocked the front door and stepped out into the freezing night. The wind hit him like a physical blow. He locked the door behind him, checking the latch twice. He turned his collar up against the cold and began the walk to his rooms. He walked in the middle of the street, avoiding the shadows of the alleyways. He kept his hand in his pocket, gripping the Colt. His eyes scanned the rooftops and the doorways. He was hunting now. He was the prey, but he was also the hunter. The date was February 2nd. The countdown had begun. The city slept, but in the dark corners of the acre and the silent halls of the White Elephant, two men were preparing for a final accounting. The law, the courts, the city council, none of it mattered anymore. It was down to the oldest law of all. The man who is willing to kill is the man who decides the future. Luke Short walked into the darkness, a solitary figure against the storm, carrying the weight of the coming war on his shoulders. February 5th, 1887. The city of Fort Worth sat paralyzed under a gray sky that refused to break, the clouds hanging low and heavy like a ceiling of dirty wool. Inside the private office at the rear of the White Elephant Saloon, the air was thick with blue tobacco smoke that swirled in the draft from the window sash. It was Saturday, a day that should have seen the main floor vibrating with the energy of 1,000 distinct conversations and the constant chime of silver coins. Instead, the silence that permeated the building was heavy, disturbed only by the occasional murmur of the few staff members who remained on duty to serve a ghost town. The mahogany desk in the center of the room was strewn with ledgers, their pages open to columns of red ink that told a story of financial exsanguination. Luke Short sat behind the desk, his chair tilted back against the wall, his boots resting on the edge of the polished wood. He was cleaning his fingernails with a small penknife, his face a mask of detached concentration. Across from him sat Jake Johnson, his partner, who paced the small rug with the frenetic energy of a caged animal. Johnson looked tired, the skin beneath his eyes dark and bruised from sleepless nights. Leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed over his chest, was Bat Masterson. The legendary lawman and gambler had arrived to offer counsel, his presence adding a gravity to the room that was impossible to ignore. He wore a dark suit and a derby hat, his eyes moving between Short and Johnson with a calm, analytical intensity. Johnson stopped pacing and slammed his hand down on the mantel of the fireplace. He stated that they could not continue on this trajectory. He pointed toward the closed door that led to the main saloon. He said the receipts were down 60%. He said the high rollers were scared to be seen in the place. He claimed that Courtright had effectively placed a quarantine on the building without ever nailing a board across the door. He said the TIC agents were stopping people on the street, whispering threats, turning carriages away before they even reached the curb. He said they were bleeding to death by inches. Short snapped the penknife shut and slipped it into his vest pocket. He looked at Johnson with eyes that were cold and flat. He asked his partner what he proposed they do. He asked if Johnson wanted to sign a check to Courtright. He asked if Johnson was ready to hand over the keys to the kingdom and let a racketeer dictate their hours, their games, and their profits. He spoke with a quiet disdain for the very idea of capitulation. He said that once they paid a dime, they would never stop paying. He said Courtright was a shark, and sharks did not stop eating until the water was empty. Masterson pushed himself off the doorframe and walked to the sideboard to pour a drink. He held the crystal decanter up to the light, inspecting the amber liquid. He spoke in a voice that was smooth and weary, the voice of a man who had seen too many range wars and town tames. He agreed with Short. He said he knew Jim Courtright. He said he had known him when he was marshal, and he knew him now. He described Courtright as a man who operated on momentum. He said Courtright believed his own legend. He said the man thought he was untouchable, a force of nature that the city required to keep order. Masterson poured the whiskey and took a sip. He turned to Johnson. He told him that paying Courtright would not buy safety. It would only buy a temporary reprieve. He said that Courtright would view payment as weakness. He said the moment they opened their wallet, Courtright would own them. He would demand more next month and more the month after that. He would install his own dealers, his own bouncers. He would turn the White Elephant into another trough for his pigs in the acre. Masterson said there was no negotiating with a man who thought he was a king. Johnson sank into a leather armchair, burying his face in his hands. He said he knew they were right, but the alternative terrified him. He was a businessman, a facilitator, a man of handshakes and contracts. He was not a gunman. He asked what the end of this road looked like. He asked if they were just waiting for a massacre. He said he had a family to think about. He said he had a reputation in the community that would be destroyed if blood was spilled on their doorstep. Short dropped his feet from the desk to the floor with a heavy thud. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the leather blotter. He told Johnson that the reputation was already damaged. He said men were staying away not just because of fear, but because they were waiting to see who was stronger. He said the West did not respect victims. He said if they let Courtright bully them, they would be laughed out of town. He said the only way to restore their standing was to show the city that the White Elephant had teeth. Masterson nodded in agreement. He said that Courtright was relying on fear. He said the man was a bully who had forgotten what it was like to face someone who didn't blink. He said Courtright's speed was gone, eroded by age and easy living. He said the man was slower than he used to be, heavy in the middle, relying on the intimidation factor of his Colt revolvers. He said Courtright was betting that Short would run. He said Courtright did not know Luke Short. Short stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at the alleyway where the gray light was fading into an early twilight. He said he had sent word to the dealers to come in armed. He said he had placed a shotgun behind the bar. He said they were ready for a siege, but he knew a siege was not the answer. He said they could not sit inside and wait for Courtright to starve them out. He said they had to force the issue. He said they had to make Courtright play his hand. Johnson looked up, his face pale. He asked what that meant. He asked if Short intended to hunt Courtright down in the street. Short shook his head. He said that would make them murderers. He said they had to wait for Courtright to make the first overt move of violence. He said they had to occupy the moral high ground, even if it was a slippery slope. He said when Courtright came for them, and he would come, it had to be clear to every witness in Fort Worth that it was self-defense. Masterson sat on the edge of the desk. He told them that Courtright was desperate. He said the TIC was running low on funds. He said Courtright had gambling debts of his own. He said the man was squeezed. He said a squeezed man was dangerous because he had no options left. He predicted that Courtright would not wait much longer. He said the silence downstairs was hurting Courtright too. He said the man's pride would not let this stand. Short turned back to the room. He checked the time on the wall clock. It was nearly 5 o'clock. The evening rush should be starting, but the street outside was quiet. He said he was tired of waiting. He said he was tired of the games. He said he wanted it finished. He looked at his hands, steady and capable. He said he had not come to Fort Worth to fight another war, but he would not shy away from one. Johnson stood up and walked to the liquor cabinet. He poured himself a drink, his hand trembling slightly. He drank it in one gulp. He said he would try to talk to Courtright one more time. He said maybe there was a misunderstanding. Maybe there was a middle ground they hadn't seen. Short and Masterson exchanged a look. They knew there was no middle ground. They knew Johnson was grasping at straws. But Short nodded. He told Johnson to go ahead. He said if Johnson could talk the devil out of his horns, he was welcome to try. Short warned Johnson to be careful. He said do not meet him in the dark. He said do not go to the acre. He said keep it public. Johnson nodded, grabbing his coat. He said he would find Courtright, uptown. He said he would try to reason with him as one businessman to another. He left the room, the door clicking shut behind him. Masterson watched the door close. He looked at Short. He said Johnson was a good man, but he was soft. He said Johnson did not understand that words had lost their currency. Short agreed. He said Johnson believed in the civilization they were trying to build. He said Johnson didn't realize that civilization was just a thin coat of paint over the raw wood of the frontier. He said when the paint chipped, the splinters were still there. Short sat back down at the desk. He opened the drawer and pulled out a box of cartridges. He began to inspect them one by one, checking the primers, checking the crimp of the brass. He did this with a ritualistic slowness. Masterson watched him. He asked Short if he was fast enough. He asked it bluntly, without sugarcoating. Short didn't look up. He said speed was fine. He said accuracy was better. He said being willing to pull the trigger when the other man hesitated was best of all. Masterson smiled a grim smile. He said Courtright would hesitate. He said Courtright was used to men cowering. He said when Courtright saw a man standing tall, it would confuse him for a fraction of a second. He said that fraction of a second was all the time in the world. He told Short to aim for the center of mass. He said don't get fancy. He said put him down and keep him down. The room darkened as the sun set completely. Short lit the kerosene lamp on the desk. The yellow light threw long, dancing shadows against the walls. It made the room feel like a cave, a den where wolves gathered to plan the hunt. Short put the cartridges back in the box. He slid the box into the drawer and locked it. He said he hoped Johnson stayed safe. He said he hoped Courtright didn't decide to make an example of the messenger. Masterson said Courtright wouldn't touch Johnson. He said Courtright needed Johnson. He said Courtright thought Johnson was the weak link, the way into the partnership. He said Courtright would try to turn Johnson against Short. He said Courtright would use honey with Johnson and vinegar with Short. Short stood up and walked to the fireplace. He stirred the coals, watching the sparks fly up the chimney. He said let him try. He said let him think he was winning. He said the surprise would be all the sweeter. He said he was ready. He felt a strange calm settling over him. The anxiety of the past week was gone. The waiting was the hardest part. Now that the end was in sight, he felt focused. He turned to Masterson. He thanked him for being there. He said it was good to have a friend in a town full of strangers. Masterson tipped his hat. He said he wouldn't miss the show. He said he would be downstairs keeping an eye on the door. He said if Courtright brought an army, Short would not be alone. Short put on his coat. He checked his reflection in the mirror over the mantel. He saw a man who looked like a banker. He adjusted his silk tie. He brushed a speck of lint from his lapel. He looked harmless. He knew that was his greatest advantage. He looked like prey. He looked like the kind of man Jim Courtright ate for breakfast. He blew out the lamp. The room plunged into darkness. He opened the door and stepped out into the hallway. The noise from the saloon was a low murmur, a pathetic echo of what it should have been. Short walked to the railing and looked down. He saw empty tables, he saw bored dealers, he saw the rot spreading. He walked down the stairs, his hand trailing on the banister. He walked with the confidence of a man who had made his peace with fate. He joined Masterson at the bar. They stood there, two legends of the West, drinking seltzer and watching the door. They were the Council of Wolves, and they had decided that the intruder in their territory had to be removed. The night wore on, slow and agonizing. Every time the door opened, heads turned. Every shadow that passed the window caused a ripple of tension. But Courtright did not come that night. He was out there in the dark, letting the fear do his work for him. Short knew it was a psychological game. He knew Courtright was tightening the screws, waiting for something to snap. Short leaned against the bar, his eyes hard. He would not snap. He would not bend. He would stand here until the stars burned out if he had to. He was the rock that the wave would break against. He signaled the bartender for a fresh glass. He took a sip, the cold water sharp on his tongue. He thought about the irony of it. He had come here to be a businessman, to leave the gunfighter life behind. And here he was, planning a war in a private office, counting bullets, waiting for a killer. The West did not let you change. It did not let you retire. It pulled you back in, dragging you down into the mud and the blood. Jake Johnson returned an hour later. He looked defeated. He said he couldn't find Courtright. He said the man was gone, vanished into the acre. He said he left a message at the agency office. Short nodded. He said it didn't matter. He said Courtright would get the message. He said silence was an answer too. They closed the saloon early again. There was no point in keeping the lights on for ghosts. As they walked out into the cold night, the wind howled around them. Short looked up at the sky. No stars, just the heavy, crushing darkness. He buttoned his coat. He knew that the next time the sun rose, it would bring the storm with it. The council was adjourned. The decision was made. Now there was nothing left to do but wait for the execution. February 8th, 1887. The dawn broke over Fort Worth with a reluctant gray light that did little to dispel the gloom of the preceding weeks. It was a Tuesday morning, and the city lay encased in a shell of frost that had formed during the night, coating the wooden boardwalks and the churned mud of the streets in a brittle white skin. The air was still and sharp, carrying the biting cold that seeped through the cracks in the window frames and settled into the bones of the early risers. There was no wind to scour the streets this morning, only a heavy, motionless chill that pressed down on the rooftops and the chimneys, trapping the coal smoke in low-hanging drifts that obscured the horizon. The silence of the city was unnatural for a weekday, lacking the usual robust clatter of commerce and the shouting of teamsters that typically marked the start of business hours. Luke Short woke before the sun had fully crested the eastern ridge. He lay in his bed in the small, tidy room he rented, staring at the water stains on the plaster ceiling. He did not move immediately. His breathing was slow and regulated, a conscious effort to oxygenate his blood and clear the remnants of sleep from his mind. He threw back the heavy wool quilt and swung his legs over the side of the mattress, his bare feet touching the cold wood of the floor. He shivered once, a physiological reaction he ignored as he stood up and walked to the wash basin on the corner stand. The water in the pitcher had a thin film of ice across the surface. He broke it with his knuckles, the sound of the cracking ice loud in the quiet room. He poured the freezing water into the porcelain bowl and splashed it onto his face. The shock of the cold tightened his skin and snapped his senses into full alertness. He reached for his shaving brush and the mug of soap, working the lather into a thick foam before applying it to his jaw and neck. He strode the straight razor against the leather strop hanging. From the wall, the rhythmic swish-clack, the only sound in the room. He shaved with methodical precision, scraping the steel across his skin to remove the stubble. leaving his face smooth and pale. He wiped the razor clean and dried his face with a rough towel. He examined his reflection in the small mirror. His eyes were clear, the whites bright, showing no signs of the stress that had plagued his partner, Jake Johnson. Short looked like a man preparing for a wedding or a funeral, treating his grooming with the reverence of a ritual. He dressed slowly. He chose a fresh white shirt, fastening the buttons from the waist up to the neck, ensuring the fabric lay flat against his chest. He attached a stiff collar, securing it with a gold stud. He pulled on his trousers, tucking the shirt in with care, and stepped into his boots. He sat on the edge of the bed to pull them on, tugging the leather until his heels seated firmly. He stood and donned his silk vest, the floral pattern subtle in the gray light. He tied his cravat, adjusting the knot until it was perfectly centered. Finally, he put on his sack coat, the dark wool brushing against his thighs. He looked the part of the successful businessman, the respectable citizen he claimed to be. Then he turned to the bedside table. His Colt revolver lay there, a dark instrument of iron and wood. He picked it up, the weight familiar and comforting in his hand. He did not simply put it in his pocket. He opened the loading gate and ejected the cartridges one by one into his palm. He inspected each round, checking the primer to ensure it was seated correctly, checking the crimp of the brass to ensure the projectile was secure. He wiped each cartridge with a cloth to remove any oil or lint that might cause a misfire. He reloaded the weapon, placing 5 rounds in the cylinder and leaving the hammer resting on an empty chamber. He snapped the gate shut and spun the cylinder, listening to the mechanical whir of the well-oiled action. He placed the gun into the leather-lined pocket on the inside of his coat. It vanished from sight, but its presence altered his center of gravity. Across town, in a boarding house near the edge of the acre, Jim Courtright was also awake. His morning routine was less fastidious. He rose from a tangle of blankets, his large frame stiff from the cold and the old injuries of a lifetime of violence. He coughed, a deep, rattling sound that cleared his lungs of the night's congestion. He dressed in the same clothes he had worn the day before, pulling on his trousers and buttoning his flannel shirt with thick, clumsy fingers. He strapped on his gun belt, the heavy leather creaking as he tightened the buckle. The 2 ivory-handled revolvers slapped against his thighs, a reassuring weight that defined his existence. He pulled on his boots, stamping his feet on the floorboards to settle them. Courtright walked out of the boarding house and into the frozen street. He did not shrink from the cold. He plowed through it. He walked toward a diner on Main Street, his breath steaming in the air like a locomotive. He entered the establishment, the bell on the door jingling sharply. The few patrons inside looked up, saw who it was, and immediately returned their attention to their plates. Courtright took a seat at a table near the window, his back to the wall. The waiter approached nervously, pouring coffee into a thick ceramic mug. Courtright ordered steak and eggs, demanding the meat be rare. He drank the coffee black and scalding hot, staring out the window at the passers-by. He chewed his food with aggressive force, his jaw muscles bunching under the skin. He looked like a man fueling an engine. The city of Fort Worth was waking up, but it was waking up with a sense of dread. The news of the standoff at the White Elephant had circulated through every saloon, barbershop, and general store in the county. Men spoke in low voices as they opened their shops, sweeping the frost from their stoops. They speculated on when the hammer would fall. They knew that 2 forces of this magnitude could not occupy the same space indefinitely. The tension was palpable, a static charge in the air that made the hair on the back of the neck stand up. The police officers on the beat were noticeably absent from the streets near the White Elephant. No one wanted to be caught in the crossfire. The law had receded, leaving the stage clear for the impending collision. Short left his rooms and walked toward the saloon. The walk was approximately 6 blocks. He moved at a steady pace, his eyes scanning the rooftops and the alley mouths. He did not walk in the shadows. He walked in the center of the sidewalk, announcing his presence. He passed a group of businessmen he knew. They nodded to him, their greeting stiff and formal. They looked at him as if he were already a ghost. Short returned the nods with a polite tip of his hat. He felt no fear, only a cold, crystalline clarity. The waiting was nearly over. The ambiguity of the threats was resolving into the certainty of action. He arrived at the White Elephant at 9 o'clock. The porter was unlocking the front doors. Short stepped inside. The saloon was cold, the fires in the stoves having burned down to embers during the night. The air smelled of stale tobacco and the faint sour odor of spilled beer that had soaked into the floorboards. Short walked to the back office and hung his coat on the rack, transferring the revolver to his hip pocket for easier access while he was in the building. He checked the ledger on the desk, though he knew the numbers would be dismal. The previous night had been the worst on record. The boycott enforced by fear was absolute. Jake Johnson arrived 20 minutes later. He looked worse than he had the day before. His eyes were red-rimmed, his skin sallow. He brought the smell of nervous sweat into the room with him. He told Short that he had not slept. He said he had heard rumors that Courtright was drinking heavily, that he was telling anyone who would listen that he was going to clean out the White Elephant before the sun went down. Short listened without interrupting. He told Johnson to calm down. He said panic would only make them sloppy. He told Johnson to go to the bar and get some coffee. The morning dragged on, the hours stretching like taffy. The saloon opened for business, but there was no business. A few drifters came in to warm themselves by the stoves, nursing single beers for an hour. But the moneyed clientele stayed away. The dealers arrived for their shifts, their faces grim. They took their places at the tables, shuffling cards for empty chairs. The roulette wheel sat motionless. The silence in the large room was amplified by the vastness of the space. Every creak of a floorboard, every clink of a glass sounded like a gunshot. Short stood at his station at the end of the bar. He polished the mahogany with a rag, his movements small and circular. He watched the front door. He watched the street through the plate glass window. He saw Courtright pass by on the other side of the street around 11 o'clock. The big man did not look in. He walked with his head up, his duster flapping around his legs. He was patrolling the perimeter, tightening the noose. Short watched him go, his eyes narrowing slightly. He knew Courtright was checking to see if they were still there, if they had packed up and run in the night. At noon, Bat Masterson came in. He looked fresh, rested. He walked to the bar and ordered a seltzer. He leaned against the rail next to Short. He asked how the morning had gone. Short told him it was quiet. Masterson nodded. He said the quiet was the worst part. He said it gave a man time to think too much. He advised Short to keep his mind occupied. He told a story about a game in Dodge City, a humorous anecdote about a cheater who got caught with an ace in his boot. Short smiled, a genuine expression that broke the mask for a moment. Masterson was doing what he did best, steadying the nerves of his friend, reminding him that life existed outside of this crisis. They ate a lunch of cold beef sandwiches standing at the bar. The food tasted like sawdust to Short, but he forced himself to eat. He needed the energy. He needed his hands to be steady. Johnson paced the floor, unable to eat. He went to the window every 5 minutes, peering out through the lace curtains. He jumped every time the door opened. Short told him to sit down. He said Johnson was making the staff nervous. Johnson sat at a table, drumming his fingers on the wood, a frantic rhythm that grated on the ears. The afternoon sun began to melt the frost on the streets. The mud turned from rock-hard ridges to a slick, sucking quagmire. Wagons struggled through the muck, the horses straining in their harnesses. The noise of the street increased, the normal sounds of the city returning as the temperature rose. But inside the White Elephant, the atmosphere remained frozen. The staff spoke in whispers. The bartender polished glasses that were already clean. The lookout in the high chair scanned the room, though there was nothing to see but empty tables and dust motes dancing in the shafts of light. Short moved to the faro bank and sat in the dealer's chair. He ran the cards through the box, practicing the slide, the turn. The mechanical action soothed him. It was a problem of pure mathematics, of order and sequence. It was the opposite of the chaos that waited outside. He dealt a hand to an invisible player. He won. He gathered the imaginary chips. He dealt again. He lost. He paid the ghost. He did this for an hour, his mind focusing entirely on the cards, shutting out the looming threat. At 3 o'clock, a messenger boy entered the saloon. He carried a note for Jake Johnson. Johnson snatched the paper from the boy's hand and tore it open. He read it quickly, his lips moving silently. He looked up at Short, his face pale. He said the note was from a mutual acquaintance, a man named Monk. The note said that Courtright had been seen at the agency office checking his guns. It said he was coming to the White Elephant this evening. It was a warning, a final courtesy from the grapevine. Short took the note and read it. He crumpled it up and tossed it into the spittoon. He said it changed nothing. He said they already knew he was coming. He told Johnson to pull himself together. He said they had to be ready. He instructed the floor manager to clear the few drifters out of the saloon. He wanted the floor empty. He did not want innocent bystanders getting hurt. The manager nodded and began to ask the men by the stove to leave. They went without protest, sensing the danger in the air. The saloon was now empty except for the staff and the 3 men at the center of the storm. Short, Johnson, and Masterson. They stood in the center of the room, a small island of resistance. Masterson checked his own weapon, a small revolver he carried in his coat pocket. He said he would back Short's play, but this was Short's fight. He said he would keep the others off him, but Courtright was Short's problem. Short nodded. He understood the code. A man had to kill his own snakes. The sun began to dip toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the floor of the saloon. The light turned from the harsh white of midday to a golden, melancholy yellow. The dust motes slowed their dance. The room seemed to contract, the walls closing in. The silence deepened. It was the silence of a held breath, the pause between the lightning and the thunder. Short walked to the front door and locked it. He turned the sign to closed. He did not want anyone wandering in by mistake. He walked back to the bar. He poured a small glass of whiskey. He did not drink it. He just held it, feeling the cool glass against his palm. He looked at the clock on the wall. It was 4:30. The day was dying. The night was being born. And with the night, the predator would come. Short thought about his life. He thought about the dusty trails, the mining camps, the boom towns. He thought about the violence that seemed to follow him like a shadow. He wondered if it was his fate to always be standing in a room waiting for a man with a gun. He wondered if he would see the sun rise tomorrow. He dismissed the thought. It was not productive. He focused on the present. He focused on the door. Johnson said he couldn't take the waiting anymore. He said he was going to go out and find Courtright. He said he had to try to stop this before it started. Short grabbed his arm. He told him it was suicide. He said Courtright was not looking for a talk. Johnson pulled away. He said he had to try. He said he knew Courtright better than Short did. He said there was still a chance for a deal. Short let him go. He knew there was no stopping a man who was driven by fear. Johnson unlocked the door and slipped out into the street. Short watched him go. He locked the door again. He turned to Masterson. He said Johnson was a fool. Masterson shrugged. He said Johnson was a businessman. He said businessmen always thought everything had a price. He said they didn't understand that some things could only be paid for in blood. The shadows stretched until they covered the entire floor. The gaslights were not yet lit. The room was dim and gray. Short stood in the twilight, a ghost in his own kingdom. He felt the weight of the Colt in his pocket. It was the only truth left in the world. The long morning was over. The afternoon was fading. The time for waiting was done. Luke Short stood ready, a statue of cold resolve, waiting for the heavy footsteps that would signal the beginning of the end. The twilight deepened over Fort Worth, transforming the gray misery of the afternoon into a heavy violet bruise that stretched across the western horizon. The transition from day to night brought a precipitous drop in temperature, freezing the slush of Main Street into jagged ridges of ice that threatened to twist the ankle of any man careless enough to walk with haste. The gas lamps along the thoroughfare began to flicker to life, ignited by the lamplighter who moved with a shivering efficiency, his long pole sparking the jets that hissed against the silence. The light they cast was yellow and sickly, creating pools of illumination that did little to push back the encroaching shadows of the alleyways where the winter wind moaned like a dying animal. Jake Johnson walked south on Main Street, his collar turned up against the biting chill, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his overcoat. He moved with a gait that was brisk but uneven, driven by a nervous energy that made his heart hammer against his ribs. He was a man accustomed to the boardroom and the private office, to the negotiation of percentages and the signing of leases. He was not built for the raw, visceral confrontation that awaited him. Every shadow that stretched across the boardwalk looked like a gunman. Every sudden noise from a saloon door opening sounded like the crack of a pistol. He felt exposed, a soft target in a city of hard men, and the knowledge of his own vulnerability sat in his stomach like a stone. He was looking for Jim Courtright. The search was not difficult, for Courtright was a creature of habit and high visibility, but the act of seeking him out felt like walking voluntarily into a lion's den. Johnson checked the usual haunts: the cigar store where the local politicians gathered to trade gossip, the shooting gallery where Courtright often practiced his draw to the applause of sycophants, and the small office of the TIC commercial agency. The office was dark, the windows staring blankly out at the street, but the word on the sidewalk pointed him toward the deeper recesses of the district, where the liquor was stronger and the lights were lower. Johnson found him standing on the sidewalk near the corner of 3rd and Main, not far from the agency's headquarters. Courtright was leaning against a hitching post, his massive frame silhouetted against the glow of a storefront window. He was alone, having dismissed his flunkies for the moment. Or perhaps they had retreated from the foul mood that radiated off him like heat from a stove. He was smoking a cigar, the ember glowing bright red with every aggressive inhalation. He looked like a monolith of the frontier, immovable and ancient, wrapped in the long duster that had become his uniform of intimidation. Johnson approached slowly, making sure his footsteps were audible on the wooden planks so as not to startle the gunman. Courtright turned his head as Johnson drew near. His eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his hat. He did not smile. He did not offer a greeting. He simply watched Johnson come into range, his hand resting casually near the butt of his gun, a silent reminder of the power dynamic between them. Johnson stopped 5 feet away, the distance of a conversation or the distance of a duel. He could smell the whiskey on Courtright, a sharp medicinal reek that cut through the cold air, mingled with the heavy smoke of the tobacco. Johnson spoke first, his voice sounding thin and reedy in his own ears. He asked Courtright if they could talk. He said he wanted to find a way to resolve the situation before it went too far. Courtright laughed, a low rumbling sound that lacked any trace of humor. He took the cigar from his mouth and inspected the ash. He asked Johnson what there was to talk about. He said the time for talking was weeks ago. He said he had made a generous offer to protect the White Elephant, and he had been insulted in front of the entire town. He said that kind of disrespect had a price, and the price had just gone up. Johnson tried to reason with him. He appealed to their past association, to the times they had drunk together, to the business they had done in the older days of the city. He said that Short was a partner, a man who brought value to the enterprise, and that squeezing him would only hurt the bottom line for everyone. He suggested that there might be a middle ground, a donation to the agency perhaps, something that could be framed as a consultancy fee rather than protection money. He was grasping at straws, trying to build a bridge over a canyon that had already collapsed. Courtright spat on the frozen ground, a glob of dark saliva landing near Johnson's boot. He said he didn't want a donation. He said he wanted what was his. He claimed that he owned the security of this town. He said that Luke Short was an interloper, a dandy from Dodge City who thought he could waltz into Fort Worth and ignore the established order. He said Short was strutting around like a peacock, flashing his diamonds and his fancy vest, while good men who had bled for this city were struggling to make ends meet. It was the logic of the resentful, the justification of a man who felt his relevance slipping away and blamed it on the success of others. Courtright pushed himself off the hitching post and took a step toward Johnson. He towered over the smaller man, using his physical size to emphasize his words. He said that Short had humiliated him. He said people were laughing at the TIC because the White Elephant was defying the ban. He said his reputation was his currency, and Short was devaluing it every day he remained open without paying tribute. He told Johnson that he was done waiting. He said the time for negotiation had expired at sundown. Johnson felt the cold sweat trickling down his back despite the freezing temperature. He looked into Courtright's eyes and saw no compromise, only a dull, flat anger that had calcified into resolve. He realized then that Masterson had been right. There was no buying this man off. Courtright didn't just want the money, he wanted the submission. He wanted Short to bend the knee, or he wanted Short dead. The realization made Johnson sick. He was standing in the presence of a man who had already decided to commit murder and was simply waiting for the opportunity to present itself. Courtright threw the stump of his cigar into the street, watching it spark as it hit the ice. He looked at Johnson with a sneer. He told Johnson to go back to the saloon. He told him to tell his little partner to come out. He said if Short was half the man he pretended to be, he would come out and face the music. He said he wanted to see Short right now, face to face on the street. It was a summons to a trial by combat, issued with the arrogance of a knight who believes his armor is impenetrable. Johnson tried one last time. He asked Courtright to sleep on it. He said they could meet in the morning, in the daylight, with lawyers present if need be. Courtright cut him off with a wave of his hand. He said there would be no lawyers. He said there would be no morning meeting. He said he was standing here and he wasn't moving until he saw Short. He told Johnson to stop whining and go deliver the message. He turned his back on Johnson, leaning against the post again, dismissing him as one would dismiss a servant. Johnson stood there for a moment, staring at the broad back of the gunman. He felt a wave of hopelessness wash over him. He had failed. He had gone out to be a peacemaker and had become a harbinger of war. He turned and began the walk back to the White Elephant. The walk felt longer this time. The street seemed wider, the shadows darker. He passed a group of men coming out of a dry goods store, and he envied their mundane conversations, their laughter. They were living in a world of groceries and weather reports. He was living in a Greek tragedy that was spiraling toward its bloody conclusion. He reached the White Elephant and paused at the door. He could see the faint light leaking through the cracks in the blinds. Inside were his friends, his partners. He was about to walk in and tell one of them to go out and die. He took a deep breath, the cold air burning his lungs, and unlocked the door. He stepped inside, the warmth of the room hitting him, smelling of stale air and tension. Luke Short was standing exactly where Johnson had left him, leaning against the bar, a glass of water in his hand. Bat Masterson was sitting on a nearby stool, his derby hat tilted back on his head, whittling a piece of kindling with a small knife. Both men looked up as Johnson entered. They did not speak immediately. They read the failure in his posture and the way he slumped against the door frame before closing it against the wind. Johnson walked over to them, his footsteps heavy on the floorboards. He poured himself a drink from the bottle on the bar, his hands shaking so badly the glass rattled against the neck of the bottle. He downed the whiskey and wiped his mouth. He looked at Short. He told him that he had found Courtright. He said the man was drunk or close to it, and he was past listening to reason. He said Courtright was angry, talking about respect and dues and how Short was laughing at him. Johnson's voice cracked as he spoke. He said he had tried to offer money, but Courtright wasn't interested in a check anymore. Short listened calmly, his expression unchanging. He set his water glass down on the bar. He asked Johnson what Courtright wanted. Johnson hesitated. He looked at the floor, then back at Short. He said Courtright wanted to see him. He said Courtright was waiting down the street near the corner. He said the exact words were to bring him out. Johnson added that Courtright was agitated, his hand never straying far from his gun. He warned Short that it was a trap, that Courtright was looking for an excuse, any excuse to draw. Masterson stopped whittling. He closed his knife with a sharp click. He looked at Short. He asked if he wanted company. He said 3 guns were better than 1. Short shook his head. He said this was personal now. He said if they all went out, it would look like a gang fight. He said Courtright had called him out specifically. To bring backup would be seen as cowardice, and in their world, cowardice was a death sentence for a reputation. Short said he had to go alone. He said it was the only way to end it. Short began to prepare. He did not rush. He walked to the coat rack in the office and retrieved his overcoat. He put it on, buttoning it carefully. He adjusted his scarf. He checked his hat, brushing a speck of dust from the brim. He was methodical, deliberate. He was slowing his heart rate, focusing his mind. He reached into his pocket and touched the handle of the Colt. He did not draw it. He just confirmed its orientation, the texture of the grip, the position of the hammer. He needed to know that it was there, an extension of his will. Johnson watched him with a mixture of awe and terror. He asked Short if he was really going to go out there. He asked if they shouldn't just lock the doors and wait for the police. Short looked at him with a faint, sad smile. He said the police weren't coming. He said the doors wouldn't hold. He said a man couldn't hide from his own life. He said it was better to meet it on the sidewalk than to be cornered in the cellar. Short turned to Masterson. He asked Bat to keep an eye on the door. He said if things went wrong, if Courtright had friends in the shadows, he expected Bat to even the odds. Masterson nodded. He said he would be right behind the glass. He said he would cover the street. He told Short to watch Courtright's eyes, not his hands. He said the eyes would move first. He told Short to get close. He said Courtright was used to shooting at distance. He wouldn't like it if Short got inside his guard. Short walked to the front of the saloon. The room was vast and empty, a cavern of silence. He could hear the wind rattling the sign outside. He could hear his own breathing. He reached the double doors and stopped. He looked back at his partners. Johnson looked like he was about to be sick. Masterson gave him a small, grim nod of encouragement. Short returned the nod. He took a breath, held it for a second, and released it. He unlocked the door and turned the handle. The latch clicked, a sound that seemed incredibly loud in the quiet room. He pushed the door open. The cold air rushed in, swirling around his legs, carrying the scent of the frozen street. Short stepped out into the vestibule, the small recessed area between the inner doors and the sidewalk. He let the door close behind him. He was outside now. The noise of the city hit him, the distant bark of a dog, the rumble of a carriage blocks away, the hiss of the gas lamps. He stood in the vestibule, for a moment letting his eyes adjust to the gloom. He looked south, down the long barrel of Main Street. He saw the figure standing near the corner, illuminated by the pool of yellow light. It was Courtright. The big man was waiting, a dark statue of patience. Short stepped out of the vestibule and onto the sidewalk. His boots crunched on the grit and the ice. He began to walk toward the figure. He did not run. He did not hide. He walked with his hands visible, his coat open enough to access his pocket. He walked with the steady, measured pace of a man walking to work. He was closing the distance. The summons had been answered. The two currents were about to collide. The walk was only a few dozen yards, but it felt like miles. Every step was a choice. Every step was a rejection of safety. Short focused on the figure ahead. He saw Courtright turn to face him. He saw the big man straighten up, pushing himself off the post. He saw the hand drop to the gun belt. Short kept walking. He was calm. He was cold. He was ready. As he walked, he noticed the small details of the night, the way the frost sparkled on the brickwork, the way the smoke from a chimney curled into a question mark against the sky, the way the light reflected in the puddles of frozen mud. The world was incredibly sharp, incredibly vivid. It was the clarity of the edge. He was walking on the razor's edge between existence and oblivion. He was 10 yards away now. He could see Courtright's face. He could see the mustache, the heavy jaw, the dark eyes. He could see the recognition. Courtright knew he had come. The game of cat and mouse was over. The mice had vanished. It was just two wolves now, circling in the winter night. Short stopped. He was close enough to speak without shouting. He was close enough to see the condensation of Courtright's breath. He was close enough to die. He waited for Courtright to make the first move. He waited for the word, the gesture, the spark that would ignite the powder keg. The street was empty around them. The city had held its breath. The stage was set. The summons had been delivered and the guest had arrived. Now the only thing left was the reckoning. Luke Short stood his ground, a small man in a large coat facing the giant of the acre. The wind blew between them, carrying the promise of violence. Time was running out. The clock in the tower of the courthouse struck 8 times, the heavy bronze notes rolling over the frozen city like a funeral toll, vibrating in the chest of every man standing on Main Street. The darkness was absolute save for the pools of sickly yellow illumination cast by the gas lamps that lined the thoroughfare, their flames shivering in the biting wind that swept down from the northern plains. The temperature had plummeted since sundown, turning the churned mud of the street into a landscape of jagged, iron-hard ruts and freezing the puddles on the boardwalks into treacherous sheets of black ice. The air was so cold it felt solid, a physical barrier that had to be pushed through with every step, stinging the lungs and numbing the exposed skin of the face instantly. Luke Short stepped out of the vestibule of the White Elephant Saloon and onto the wooden sidewalk, the heels of his polished boots making a sharp, distinctive clack against the frost-rimed planks. He did not pause to adjust his eyes to the gloom. His gaze was already fixed on the figure waiting for him a short distance away. Beside him, Jake Johnson moved with a jerky, nervous energy, his breath coming in short, visible puffs of steam that vanished rapidly into the wind. Johnson was the bridge between the two worlds colliding this night, a man of commerce trapped between two engines of destruction. And his fear was a palpable thing that radiated off him like the scent of sickness. Short ignored him, his entire consciousness narrowed down to the man standing in the shadows of the shooting gallery 1 block away. The walk was not long, perhaps one full city block, but it stretched out into an eternity of sensory details that Short's heightened mind recorded with photographic clarity. He noticed the way the frost sparkled on the iron hitching rail like crushed diamonds. He saw the texture of the brickwork on the facade of the building, the rough red clay, darkened by years of soot and grime. He heard the distant mournful whistle of a train leaving the depot, a sound of departure and journey that seemed mockingly irrelevant to the finality of the moment. He felt the weave of his wool coat against his wrists and the reassuring pressure of the Colt revolver resting in the leather-lined pocket against his left hip. He did not touch the weapon. He kept his hands relaxed, his thumbs hooked casually into the armholes of his silk vest, a posture of non-threatening confidence that was entirely calculated. Jim Courtright stood waiting in front of Ella Blackwell's shooting gallery, a fitting backdrop for a man who had made his living by the gun. He was leaning against one of the wooden supports of the awning, his massive frame dominating the sidewalk, blocking the path like a boulder in a stream. The gaslight from the window behind him caught the silver conchos on his hat band and the ivory handles of the two revolvers on his hips, making them glow with a spectral luminescence. He was wearing his signature duster, the heavy canvas falling to his calves, stained with the mud of the acre and the grease of cheap chop houses. He looked ancient and elemental, a relic of a wilder time that refused to be civilized, a monster of the frontier who had come to collect a debt of blood. As Short and Johnson approached, Courtright pushed himself off the post and stood to his full height. He towered over Short by nearly a foot, a disparity in size that he usually used to cow his opponents into submission. He did not smile. His face was a mask of dark, brooding anger, the eyes shadowed by the brim of his hat, the heavy mustache hiding the set of his mouth. He smelled of stale whiskey and onions, a pungent cloud that assaulted Short's nose as they closed the distance to conversational range. Short did not flinch or slow his pace. He walked right up to the giant, stopping less than 3 feet away, invading the personal space that Courtright claimed as his dominion. Johnson spoke first, his voice high and strained, trying desperately to defuse the bomb that was ticking in the freezing air. He gestured between the two men with a trembling hand, performing a macabre introduction that was unnecessary. He told Courtright that here was Luke, just as he had asked. He said that Luke wanted to talk, to work things out like gentlemen. Johnson's words were rushed, spilling over each other in his haste to fill the silence, to prevent the violence that hovered between them like a suspended blade. He looked from one man to the other, his eyes wide and pleading, begging for sanity in a situation that had long since abandoned it. Courtright ignored Johnson completely. His eyes were locked on Short, boring into him with a dull, predatory intensity. He spoke with a voice that was a low rumble, a sound like rocks grinding together deep underground. He asked Short why he was hurting his business. It was not a question, it was an accusation, a statement of grievance that laid the blame for Courtright's own failures squarely at Short's feet. He said that Short's refusal to pay the agency was causing others to lose respect, causing the revenue stream to dry up. He spoke with the entitlement of a man who believed the world owed him a living simply because he was dangerous. Short looked up at the big man, craning his neck slightly to meet his gaze. His face was smooth, unreadable, the face of a poker player holding a winning hand or a man resigned to his fate. He spoke quietly, his voice even and devoid of fear, cutting through the bluster of the larger man. He told Courtright that no one was hurting his business but himself. He said that the White Elephant was a private enterprise, not a tributary to the TIC commercial agency. He said that respect was earned, not bought with extortion threats and bullying tactics. He kept his hands near his chest, close to his lapels, a position that looked defensive, but kept his right hand inches from the butt of his gun. Courtright sneered, the expression twisting his features into a mask of contempt. He stepped closer, reducing the gap between them to a mere arm's length. He loomed over Short, using his physical bulk to block out the light from the street, casting Short in his shadow. He said that Short was a small man with a big mouth. He said that in Fort Worth, men like Short usually learned their place or they disappeared. He mentioned the laws he could enforce, the charges he could fabricate, the misery he could inflict. He was listing his weapons, trying to find the one that would make Short crumble, trying to find the fear that he fed upon. Short did not back up. He planted his feet firmly on the icy wood, his boots finding purchase in the frost. He told Courtright that he had heard enough threats. He said that if Courtright had legal papers to serve, he should serve them. If he had a warrant, he should produce it, but if he was just there to bark, Short had a business to run. He dismissed the giant with a slight shake of his head, a gesture of profound disrespect that hit Courtright harder than a physical blow. It was the rejection of his authority, the denial of his power, the shattering of the illusion he had built around himself. Johnson interjected again, stepping slightly between them, trying to act as a physical buffer. He told Jim to calm down. He told Luke to be reasonable. He was sweating despite the cold, the moisture freezing on his forehead. He said they could go inside, have a drink, sit down at a table and look at the numbers. He said there was plenty of money for everyone if they just kept their heads. He was negotiating with ghosts, talking to men who had already left the realm of commerce and entered the arena of survival. Courtright looked at Johnson with disgust. He told him to shut his mouth. He said this didn't concern him anymore. He turned his attention back to Short, his eyes narrowing. He asked Short if he was healed. He used the vernacular of the gunfighter, asking if Short was carrying a weapon. It was a direct challenge, a prelude to the draw. By the code of the West, if Short admitted he was armed, the fight could begin instantly. If he denied it, Courtright might hesitate, or he might gun him down anyway. Short looked Courtright in the eye. He lied. He said he had no gun. He said he was not there to fight. He spread his hands slightly, showing his open palms, a gesture of surrender that was entirely deceptive. He kept his elbows tight to his ribs, his hands hovering near the lapels of his coat. He was buying time, confusing the predator, forcing Courtright to process conflicting information. He knew that Courtright expected him to be terrified or to be reaching for a weapon. By doing neither, he disrupted the big man's OODA loop, creating a fraction of a second of hesitation. Courtright blinked. He looked at Short's waist, looking for the telltale bulge of a holster. He saw nothing. Short's coat was loose, the lines clean. He looked back at Short's face, searching for the lie. He saw only the flat, cold stare of a man who had accepted death. Courtright grunted. He said that a man who walked out to meet him without a gun was a fool. He said he ought to pistol whip him right there in the street to teach him a lesson. He reached out with his left hand, grabbing Short by the shoulder, his fingers digging into the wool of the coat. The physical contact broke the spell of the standoff. Short did not pull away. He let Courtright grab him. He felt the immense strength of the man, the brute power that had crushed so many others. But he also felt the tremor in the hand, the slight shake that betrayed the alcohol in the nerves. Courtright was not the rock he pretended to be. He was a crumbling statue held together by pride and rage. Short looked down at the hand on his shoulder, then back up at Courtright. He asked him to remove his hand. He said he was not a dog to be handled. Courtright laughed, a harsh barking sound. He did not let go. He pulled Short closer, bringing their faces inches apart. Short could see the broken veins in Courtright's nose, the yellow stain of tobacco on his teeth. Courtright whispered that he would do whatever he pleased. He said he owned this street. He said he owned Short. He moved his right hand toward his gun, not in a draw, but in a gesture of threat, resting his palm on the ivory grip, his fingers drumming on the metal. Short watched the hand. He saw the thumb hook over the hammer. He saw the index finger curl near the trigger guard. He knew the mechanics of the draw. He knew that Courtright carried 2 guns but favored the one on his right hip. He knew that Courtright was a cross-draw artist, meaning he would reach across his body or twist his wrist to pull the weapon. It was a fast draw, but it required a specific motion, a clearing of leather that took time. Short's own weapon was inches from his hand, requiring only a dip of the shoulder and a lift of the wrist. Johnson backed away, realizing that words were useless. He retreated toward the wall of the shooting gallery, pressing himself against the bricks, trying to make himself small. He watched with wide, horrified eyes as the 2 men stood locked in their silent struggle. He saw the steam of their breath mingling in the air, the only sign of life in the frozen tableau. He wanted to run, but his legs refused to obey. He was a witness to history, and history demanded his presence. The wind picked up, howling down the canyon of Main Street, rattling the sign of the shooting gallery above their heads. The gaslight flickered violently, casting erratic shadows that danced across Courtright's face, making him look like a demon shifting forms. Short felt the cold seeping through his boots, but he pushed the sensation away. He needed his nerves to be electric, his muscles to be liquid. He focused on his breathing, keeping it slow and deep, oxygenating his blood for the explosion of effort that was coming. Courtright released Short's shoulder with a shove, pushing him back a step. He wanted distance. He wanted the space to draw, the room to maneuver. He stepped back himself, clearing his coat from his gun belt. He stood with his legs apart, a gunfighter's stance, waiting for the signal. He asked Short one last time if he was going to pay. He said it was the last chance. He said the offer expired in 10 seconds. Short adjusted his vest. It was a small movement, a fussing with his clothes that looked like nervousness but was actually preparation. He moved the flap of his coat aside, clearing the path to his pocket. He looked at Courtright with a sadness that was genuine. He said there was no money. He said there never would be money. He said the answer was no, now and forever. He said they were done talking. The finality of the words hung in the air like smoke. Courtright heard them and understood that he had been beaten. He had been beaten not by force but by will. The small man had refused to break. The money was gone. The reputation was gone. All that was left was the violence. It was the only currency Courtright had left to spend. The decision formed in his eyes, a hardening of the gaze, a narrowing of the pupils. Short saw the shift. He saw the decision being made. He saw the impulse travel from Courtright's brain to his shoulder, down his arm to his hand. He saw the shoulder dip. He saw the elbow flare. It was happening. The abyss had opened and they were both stepping into it. There was no going back. The law was gone. The city was gone. There was only the physics of motion and the chemistry of gunpowder. Time seemed to slow down, stretching into an infinite present. Short could see the individual flakes of snow that were beginning to fall, drifting down through the gaslight. He could hear the beat of his own heart, a slow, heavy drum in his ears. Watched Courtright's hand close around the grip of the Colt. He watched the knuckles turn white. He watched the muscles in the forearm bunch. Short did not wait for the weapon to clear leather. He did not wait for the threat to become a reality. He acted. He abandoned the pretense of the unarmed man. He abandoned the role of the victim. He moved his hand with a speed that defied the cold, blurring into the pocket of his coat. His fingers found the checkered wood of his own revolver. His thumb found the hammer. The sidewalk seemed to tilt under their feet. The buildings seemed to lean in to watch. The world narrowed down to a tunnel, at the end of which stood Jim Courtright, a giant made of shadow and malice. Short gripped his weapon. He felt the cold iron against his palm. He felt the trigger against his finger. He was not angry. He was not afraid. He was simply a mechanic performing a necessary repair on a broken world. Courtright shouted something, a wordless roar of rage, and effort as he yanked his gun upward. The leather of his holster creaked loudly, a sound like a tearing sheet. The ivory handle flashed in the light. He was fast, incredibly fast for a man of his size, fueled by adrenaline and desperation. But he was pulling against gravity, against the friction of the holster, against the weight of his own coat. Short was pulling from a pocket, a shorter distance, a cleaner line. He was drawing from a place of stillness, while Courtright was drawing from a place of chaos. The geometry of the fight favored the smaller man. The physics of the draw favored the shorter barrel. The psychology of the moment favored the one who had accepted the outcome before the first move was made. Short began to lift the gun. He felt the barrel clear the lining of the pocket. He felt the weight of the weapon transfer to his wrist. He began to level the muzzle, pointing it not at the sky, but at the center of the dark mass in front of him. He was stepping into the abyss, but he was doing it with his eyes open. The distance between them was less than 4 feet. It was close enough to burn with the powder. It was close enough to see the surprise dawning on Courtright's face. As he realized he was second, it was close enough to smell the death that was coming. The street was silent no longer. The silence was about to be shattered by the thunder of the gods. Short's thumb pulled the hammer back. Click. The sound was small, mechanical, precise. It was the sound of a lock opening. It was the sound of a life ending. Courtright heard it. His eyes went wide. He tried to hurry, his hand jerking the gun up, the barrel catching on his duster for a fraction of a second. That fraction was the difference between history and oblivion. Short's finger tightened on the trigger. He did not aim with his eye. He aimed with his body, with his instinct. He pointed his finger, and the gun was simply an extension of that finger. He looked at the button on Courtright's vest. He looked at the heart beating beneath it. He took the final step. The abyss swallowed them both. The darkness of the street was shattered not by a scream, but by a chemical reaction. Inside the brass casing of the .45 caliber cartridge sitting in the chamber of Luke Short's revolver, the primer was struck by the firing pin. This impact created a spark that ignited the black powder charge, transforming the solid granules into a rapidly expanding gas that required an escape route. The pressure inside the cylinder spiked instantly, forcing the soft metal projectile down the rifled barrel of the weapon. The physics of the event were absolute and non-negotiable, a violent transfer of kinetic energy that occurred faster than the human eye could process. The muzzle flash blossomed like a sudden angry sun in the gloom of the winter night, a jagged sphere of orange and white fire that momentarily banished the shadows and illuminated the terrified face of Jake Johnson pressed against the brick wall. The sound arrived a fraction of a second later, a flat, hard crack that sounded like a dry branch snapping but amplified 1,000 times. It was not the rolling boom of a cannon, but the sharp, stinging report of a handgun fired at close range. The noise slapped against the wooden storefronts and the glass windows of the White Elephant, echoing down the canyon of Main Street. Short felt the recoil kick back into the web of his hand, a familiar jolt that traveled up his forearm and into his shoulder. He did not fight the muzzle climb. He rode it, letting the energy dissipate before bringing the sights back down into alignment. He was not thinking about the noise or the flash. He was thinking about the target. The projectile covered the 4 feet between the two men in less than 4 milliseconds. It did not aim for the chest or the head. Whether by luck or by the supreme instinct of a man fighting for his life, the slug flew true toward the center of the threat. Jim Courtright was in the process of cocking his single-action Colt, his thumb hooked over the hammer, pulling it back to rotate the cylinder and prepare the weapon for firing. The hammer was halfway back when Short's bullet arrived. The heavy .45 caliber ball struck Courtright's thumb directly on the tip, smashing into the digit that was applying the necessary torque to the mechanism. The impact was catastrophic. The soft metal of the bullet flattened against the bone, shattering the distal phalanx and obliterating the nail bed. The force of the strike blew the thumb backward, severing the tendons and tearing the flesh away in a ragged spray of red mist. The hammer of Courtright's gun, suddenly released from the tension of the thumb, snapped back down, but not with enough force to fire the cartridge, or perhaps it fell on a safety notch. The weapon was rendered useless in that microsecond. The mechanism of the single-action revolver required the manual retraction of the hammer to fire. Without a thumb to retract it, the gun was nothing more than a 2-pound club of steel and wood. Courtright did not immediately understand what had happened. The pain had not yet registered in his brain. The nerves were overloaded by the trauma. He only knew that his gun had not fired. He looked down at his hand, confused by the sudden wetness, the strange shape of his own anatomy. He saw the blood pumping from the ruin of his thumb, splattering onto the pristine ivory handle of his revolver. He saw the hammer down. He tried to move his thumb to hook it over the spur again, but the muscle command met no resistance. The digit was gone or hanging by a thread of skin, utterly incapable of performing its function. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. His primary weapon, the tool he had used to dominate the acre for a decade, had failed him because his own body had been disassembled. He looked up at Short. His eyes were wide, the pupils dilated in the low light. There was no anger in them now, only a profound shock. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to curse, perhaps to plead, but no sound came out. He began to fumble with the gun, trying to execute a border shift, a maneuver where the gunman tosses the weapon to his left hand to continue the fight. It was a desperate move, a clumsy attempt to regain the initiative in a battle that was already lost. His movements were jerky, uncoordinated, the fine motor skills stripped away by the massive dump of adrenaline and the physical shock of the injury. The heavy duster coat swirled around his legs as he staggered backward, trying to put distance between himself and the muzzle that was still pointed at him. Short did not hesitate. He did not wait to see if Courtright would surrender. He did not pause to admire his marksmanship. He saw the big man still standing, still holding a weapon, still a threat. Short pulled the hammer of his own gun back again. Click. The cylinder rotated, bringing a fresh cartridge into line with the barrel. The mechanical precision of Short's weapon stood in stark contrast to the bloody failure of Courtright's. Short adjusted his aim slightly. The first shot had been a reaction. The second shot was an execution. He lowered the barrel a fraction of an inch, aiming for the center of the dark mass that was Courtright's torso. He squeezed the trigger. The second muzzle flash lit up the night, brighter this time as Short's eyes were already dilated. The recoil bucked again. The second slug slammed into Courtright's chest in the heart. The impact stopped Courtright's backward stumble and held him suspended in place for a heartbeat, as if an invisible hand had grabbed him by the lapels. The bullet punched through the heavy canvas of the duster, through the wool of the vest, through the linen shirt. It struck a rib, shattering the bone into jagged splinters that became secondary projectiles, tearing into the soft tissue of the lung and the pericardium. The pain hit Courtright then, hit a massive, crushing weight in the center of his chest. It felt as if a mule had kicked him, driving the air from his lungs. He gasped, a wet, rattling sound as blood began to fill his airway. He dropped his gun. The ivory-handled Colt clattered to the wooden sidewalk, landing in a patch of frozen mud. It lay there, useless and shining, a symbol of the power that had just been stripped away. Courtright brought his hands to his chest, clutching at the hole in his coat, trying to hold the life inside his body. The blood was dark and thick, oozing between his fingers, staining the frost on his duster. Short was not done. He had seen men hit before who kept coming. He had seen men dead on their feet who still managed to pull a trigger. He fired a third time. The shot was low, hitting Courtright in the right shoulder, spinning him slightly to the side. The bullet tore through the deltoid muscle and lodged in the scapula, cracking the shoulder blade. The kinetic energy of the round forced Courtright to turn, exposing his back to the street. He looked like a drunk man trying to navigate a slippery floor, his feet tangling in the long hem of his coat. Short lowered his gun. The silence that followed the 3 shots was deafening. It rushed back into the street like water filling a void, heavy and oppressive. The smoke from the black powder hung in the air between them, a sulphurous gray cloud that stung the eyes and tasted of brimstone. Through the haze, Short watched the giant fall. It was not a quick collapse. It was a slow, agonizing descent. Courtright's knees buckled first, hitting the wooden planks with a heavy thud. He swayed there for a moment on his knees, his head bowing low as if in prayer. He looked at the ground, at the blood dripping from his thumb and his chest, forming a dark pool on the ice. Then the rest of him followed. He fell forward, catching himself with his good hand for a second before his arm gave out. He sprawled face down on the sidewalk, his massive body covering the width of the planks. His hat tumbled off his head and rolled into the gutter. The wind caught his long hair, blowing it across his face. He made a sound, a low groan that bubbled up through the blood in his throat. It was the sound of a man trying to breathe when his lungs were compromised. He twitched once, a spasm that ran down his spine to his boots, and then he lay still. Jake Johnson peeled himself away from the wall. He was shaking so violently his teeth chattered. He looked at the body of Jim Courtright, then at Luke Short. He looked at the gun in Short's hand, smoke still wisping from the barrel. Johnson's eyes were wide with horror. He had just witnessed the impossible. The king of the acre, the man who had terrified Fort Worth for years, had been cut down in less than 5 seconds. The violence had been so fast, so brutal that Johnson's mind could barely process the sequence of events. He stepped toward Short, his hands raised as if to ward off a ghost. Short stood his ground. He did not holster his weapon. He kept it trained on the fallen form, waiting for any sign of movement. He listened to the wheezing breath of the dying man. It was a wet, ragged sound growing fainter with each exhalation. Short watched the rise and fall of the duster. The movement was shallow, irregular. The internal damage was massive. The heart was pumping blood into the chest cavity, dropping the blood pressure to 0. The brain was starving for oxygen. The lights were going out in the mind of Jim Courtright. People began to emerge from the shadows. The shots had drawn them out like moths to a flame. Men spilled out of the White Elephant, out of the shooting gallery, out of the saloons down the street. They gathered in a circle, keeping a respectful distance from the man with the smoking gun. They looked at the body on the ground, whispering to each other. They pointed at the gun lying in the mud. They pointed at the blood. They looked at Short with a mixture of fear and awe. He was no longer just a gambler. He was the man who had killed the giant. Short looked at the crowd, then back at Courtright. He saw the chest stop moving. He heard the final rattle of air escape the throat. The silence was absolute now. The wind howled, but the man on the ground did not hear it. Jim Courtright was dead. The reign of the TIC commercial agency had ended in a puddle of blood on a frozen Tuesday night. Short slowly let the hammer of his Colt down. He checked the cylinder. 2 rounds left. He did not reload. He slid the gun back into his coat pocket. The weight of it was different now. It was heavier, burdened with the reality of what it had done. He felt a strange numbness spreading through his body. It was not the cold. It was the adrenaline crash. His hands were steady, but his knees felt like water. He took a deep breath of the freezing air, trying to clear the smell of powder from his nose. A police officer came running up the street, blowing a whistle. He pushed through the crowd, his baton in his hand. He stopped when he saw the body. He looked at Short. He knew who Courtright was. He knew who Short was. He saw the situation clearly. He did not raise his baton. He did not draw his gun. He simply stood there, looking at the carnage, unsure of how to arrest a man for killing a legend. Short spoke first. His voice was calm, flat, the same voice he used to call a bluff at the poker table. He told the officer that it was self-defense. He said Courtright drew first. He pointed to the gun on the ground, the ivory grip stained with blood. He pointed to Johnson. He said Johnson saw it all. Johnson nodded frantically, eager to corroborate the story, eager to be on the side of the living. The officer looked at the gun. He saw the hammer down. He saw the blood. He looked at Courtright's hand, the missing thumb. He understood the mechanics of the fight. He nodded slowly. He told Short he would have to come down to the station. He said it was procedure. Short nodded. He said he understood. He said he would come quietly. He was not running. He had stood his ground, and he was still standing. Short looked down at Courtright one last time. The big man looked smaller in death, deflated, a pile of old clothes and broken bones. The mystery was gone. The terror was gone. It was just meat and fluid and physics. Short felt no triumph. He felt no joy. He felt only a cold, hollow relief. The threat was removed. The business could continue. The price had been paid. He turned to Bat Masterson, who had appeared at his elbow. Masterson looked at the body, then at Short. He nodded once, a gesture of professional respect. He said it was clean work. He said Courtright never had a chance. Short didn't answer. He didn't feel like it was clean. He felt the grease of the slaughter on his soul. But he knew it was necessary. In the world they lived in, there were only the quick and the dead, and tonight Luke Short was quick. He began to walk toward the officer, his boots crunching on the ice. The crowd parted for him, opening a path. They looked at him with new eyes. They saw the cold iron in his spine. They saw the man who wouldn't pay. They saw the survivor. Short walked with his head up, his face set in stone. He walked away from the abyss, leaving the body of his enemy to the winter wind. The clock in the courthouse tower chimed the quarter hour. It was 8:15. 10 minutes had passed since the first shot. 10 minutes that had changed the history of the city. The echoes of the gunfire had faded, but the story was just beginning. The story of the night the corrupt lawman came to collect, and the saloon owner paid him in the only currency that truly mattered in the West. Short stepped off the sidewalk and into the street, following the officer. He did not look back. He knew what was behind him. He knew what was ahead. He was Luke Short, the king of the White Elephant, and he had just defended his throne. They began the walk to the station. It was not a long journey, but it felt like a procession. The crowd that had gathered from the saloons and the gambling halls parted to let them pass. Men who had spent years paying protection money to the TIC commercial agency watched in silence as the killer of their tormentor walked by in the custody of the city. There were no jeers, no cheers. The shock was too fresh. They looked at Short with a mixture of fear and respect, trying to reconcile the image of the dandy gambler with the man who had just outdrawn the most feared gunman in Texas. The only sound was the crunch of boots on the frozen mud and the distant, mournful whistle of a train leaving the depot. Back at the scene of the shooting, Bat Masterson stood guard over the body. He had stepped out of the White Elephant the moment the firing ceased, his own weapon in his hand, ready to suppress any retaliation from Courtright's cronies. But there was no retaliation. The thugs who had followed Courtright were nowhere to be seen, having vanished into the shadows of the acre the moment their leader fell. Masterson holstered his gun and looked down at the man he had known for years. He saw the ruin of the hand, the thumb shot away, and the dark stains spreading across the back of the duster. He signaled to two men standing nearby, ordering them to fetch a wagon. The king of the acre could not be left to freeze on the sidewalk. Jake Johnson remained pressed against the wall of the shooting gallery, his face the color of old parchment. He had witnessed the entire event from a distance of 3 feet. and the trauma of the noise and the blood had rendered him mute. A friend from the saloon came out and took him by the arm, guiding him back inside toward the warmth of the stove and a bottle of whiskey. Johnson moved like a sleepwalker, his eyes fixed on the middle distance, replaying the sequence of the draw over and over in his mind. He knew that his testimony would be the hinge upon which Short's freedom swung, and the weight of that responsibility settled onto his shoulders like a yoke of iron. Short and Officer Fulford arrived at the city jail. It was a squat brick building that smelled of carbolic acid, unwashed bodies, and stale tobacco smoke. The desk sergeant looked up from his ledger as they entered. He saw the prisoner and put his pen down. He did not ask what the charge was. The news had traveled faster than the men. He opened a new page in the blotter and dipped his pen into the inkwell. He asked for the name. Short gave it clearly. Luke L. Short. The sergeant wrote it down in a flowing script. He asked for the occupation. Short paused for a second, then said, "Gambler." The sergeant wrote that down as well. Fulford placed Short's gun on the desk. He explained that it was the weapon used in the shooting of Jim Courtright. The sergeant looked at the gun, then at Short. He asked if Short had any other weapons on his person. Short shook his head. He was patted down by a second officer, a rough search that yielded a pocket knife, a watch, and a roll of currency. These items were placed in an envelope and logged. Short was then led to a holding cell at the rear of the building. The door was made of iron bars that were cold to the touch. Short stepped inside and the door clanged shut with a heavy metallic finality. He sat on the narrow wooden bench attached to the wall. The cell was empty of other prisoners. A single kerosene lamp burned in the corridor, casting long, jumping shadows through the bars. Short rested his elbows on his knees and clasped his hands. He looked at his fingers. They were steady. He felt a profound numbness, a separation from his own body. He knew that outside these walls the city was erupting in chaos and speculation, but in here there was only the dripping of water from a leaky pipe and the scratching of rats in the walls. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, forcing his heart rate to slow down. He had played the hand he was dealt, and now he had to wait for the dealer to pay out. Outside on Main Street, the wagon arrived to collect the body. The undertaker, a somber man named Collins, directed 2 assistants to lift the corpse. Courtright was a large man, dead weight in the truest sense, and his coat was stiff with frozen blood. The assistants grunted with effort as they hoisted him up. His boots scraped against the tailgate of the wagon. They slid him onto the wooden bed and covered him with a rough wool blanket. The crowd watched this indignity with morbid fascination. The removal of the body broke the spell. The monster was just meat now, cargo to be hauled away to a slab. As the wagon rattled away over the ice, the talk began. It started as whispers and grew into a dull roar. Men gathered in the saloons, ordering rounds of whiskey to warm their blood. They dissected the fight, arguing over who drew first, how many shots were fired, where the bullets hit. The mythology was already being written. Some said Courtright's gun had jammed, others said Short had a sleeve gun. But the prevailing sentiment, the one that was toasted in the respectable bars uptown, was relief. The shadow that had hung over the business district had been lifted. The extortion was over. The tax collector was dead. Back at the jail, the door to the station opened again. Bat Masterson walked in, followed closely by a local attorney named William Capps. Masterson walked with a purpose, his derby hat tilted low. He went straight to the desk sergeant. He demanded to know the bail amount. The sergeant looked uncomfortable. He said the magistrate had not yet set a hearing. Masterson leaned over the desk. He said that this was a clear case of self-defense, witnessed by half the town. He said they were prepared to post bond immediately. He dropped a heavy leather bag onto the desk. It clinked with the sound of gold coins. The legal machinery began to turn, lubricated by money and influence. The sergeant sent a runner to the magistrate's house. Cap sat down with Short in the cell, speaking in low, urgent tones. He told Short that Johnson was giving a statement. He said the police report would show that Courtright made the first move toward his weapon. He said that with Courtright's reputation as a killer, no jury in Fort Worth would convict a man for defending himself. Short listened, nodding occasionally. He trusted Capps. He trusted Masterson. He knew the game was played in the courtroom just as it was played at the card table. By 9:30, the magistrate arrived, looking disheveled and annoyed at being summoned from his home. He convened a makeshift hearing in the front office of the jail. He reviewed the initial report from Officer Fulford. He looked at the prisoner. He set the bond at $2,000, a massive sum for the time. Masterson and Capps produced the funds without blinking. The money was counted out on the sergeant's desk, stacks of double eagles gleaming in the lamplight. The sergeant wrote out a receipt. He unlocked the cell door. Luke Short walked out of the cell. He retrieved his personal effects from the envelope. He put his watch back in his vest pocket and checked the time. It was 9:45. He had been a prisoner for less than 2 hours. He put on his hat and adjusted the brim. He asked for his gun. The sergeant shook his head. He said the weapon was evidence and would be held until the inquest. Short accepted this. He turned to Masterson and nodded. They walked out of the jail together, stepping back into the freezing night. The walk back to the White Elephant was different. The streets were still crowded, but the mood had shifted. People stepped aside with deference. They tipped their hats. Short was no longer the outsider. He was the man who had cleaned up the town. He did not acknowledge the stares. He walked straight ahead, his eyes fixed on the lights of his saloon. He was tired. The exhaustion was bone deep now. He wanted a hot bath and a clean shirt. When they entered the White Elephant, the room went silent for a second, then erupted into applause. It was a spontaneous release of tension from the staff and the patrons. Short raised a hand to stop them. He did not want adulation. He walked to the bar and poured a glass of mineral water. He drank it in one long swallow. He looked at the spot on the floor where he had stood earlier that evening, waiting for the summons. It seemed like a lifetime ago. Jake Johnson came out of the back office. He looked sober now, shaken but functioning. He shook Short's hand. He didn't say anything. There were no words for what they had shared. They were partners in a business that had just required the ultimate liquidation of a liability. Johnson went back to the office to close the books for the night. The ledger would show a loss in revenue, but a gain in future stability. The news of the shooting had reached the Acre by now. The brothels and the dive bars were quiet. The thugs who had operated under Courtright's protection were packing their bags or looking for new alliances. The power vacuum would be filled eventually, but for tonight there was a pause. The structure of the criminal underworld had been decapitated. The TIC commercial agency was defunct. The badge that Courtright had worn was now just a piece of tin in a dead man's pocket. Short went upstairs to the private rooms. He sat in a velvet armchair and looked out the window at the street below. He could see the dark stain on the sidewalk where Courtright had fallen. Someone had thrown a bucket of sand over it to cover the blood, but the dark patch was still visible against the frost. Short watched as a stray dog sniffed at the sand and then trotted away. He thought about the mechanics of the fight. He thought about the thumb. It was a small thing, a digit of flesh and bone. If the bullet had missed the thumb, if the hammer had fallen, Short would be the one on the slab at the undertaker's. It was a game of inches, a game of fractions. He rubbed his own hand, feeling the integrity of his knuckles. He was alive. That was the only fact that held any weight. The clock in the courthouse tower struck 10. The deep notes rolled over the city again. The night moved on. The trains moved on. The cattle in the stockyards shifted in their pens, unaware that the predator who had claimed their owner's profits was gone. Fort Worth was a hard town, a place of commerce and violence, and it did not pause for the dead. It simply absorbed them into the soil and paved over the spot. Short stood up and drew the curtains. He shut out the street, the cold, and the memory of the giant in the duster. He turned down the gaslight until the room was dim. He sat in the darkness, listening to the muffled sounds of the piano from the floor below. The music was ragtime, bright and syncopated. The world was returning to its rhythm. The interruption was over. The law had been silent when Courtright was extorting the city. The law had been silent when the TIC beat men in the alleys. But the law of physics, the law of the gun, had spoken clearly at 8:15. And in the silence that followed, Luke Short found his peace. He closed his eyes and finally, for the first time in weeks, he let his guard down. He slept, a small man in a large chair, while the city outside reorganized itself around the new reality he had created with 3 pulls of a trigger. The inquest would follow. The trial would follow. But the verdict had already been rendered on the sidewalk. The corrupt lawman had come to collect and the account was settled.